Welcome, my friends. Tonight, we're sitting down to a very different kind of feast, one that most history books skip entirely. We're talking about food, but not the kind served in grand palaces or noble courts. No, tonight we're exploring what the common soldier actually ate during the most devastating conflict in human history, World War II. Before we begin this culinary journey through wartime, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you perhaps enjoying a late night snack while listening? Maybe you're having breakfast somewhere across the globe. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because tonight's journey is going to take us from American K-rations to Japanese rice balls, from German sausages to Soviet cabbage soup, and trust me, it's going to be unforgettable. Now, settle in. Maybe grab a cup of coffee or tea, something our soldiers would have killed for in those foxholes. Dim the lights if you'd like, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. You see, when we think of World War II, our minds immediately conjure up images of epic battles, heroic charges, and black-and-white newsreels showing tanks rolling across European plains. We picture Churchill's defiant speeches, Roosevelt's fireside chats, and the dramatic moments that defined a generation. But rarely, almost never, do we stop to ask the really gritty human questions. What did that soldier storming Normandy Beach have for breakfast that morning? And if he did manage to eat something, what on earth was it? I can tell you right now, it definitely wasn't pancakes and maple syrup. The truth is, feeding millions of men scattered across multiple continents wasn't just a logistical challenge. It was a logistical nightmare that would make modern supply chain managers break out in cold sweats. These rations had to be portable enough for a soldier to carry while running through enemy fire, non-perishable enough to survive months in tropical jungles or Arctic winters, cheap enough that governments could afford to produce them by the millions, and, if we're being completely honest, hopefully not so terrible that they'd make grown men weep into their mess kits. Flavor, sadly, ranked somewhere around 5th priority, nestled comfortably between won't explode if you drop it and hopefully doesn't attract rats. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Different nations approached this impossible challenge in completely different ways. And those approaches tell us as much about their cultures, their resources, and their attitudes toward their own soldiers as any battle strategy ever could. The Americans, with their characteristic faith in technology and mass production, tried to science their way to sustenance. They created these compact little boxes of military optimism called K-rations, packed with everything a soldier theoretically needed to survive another day of war. Whether those soldiers wanted to survive on those particular foods was apparently a secondary consideration. The Germans, at least early in the war, sent their troops marching across Europe with hearty helpings of meat, rye bread, and genuine sausage, a preview of the efficiency and organization that initially made their military machine so formidable. But as the war dragged on and resources grew scarce, that same military precision turned to creating ersatz products, substitutes that bore only a passing resemblance to actual food. The British, true to form, clung to tea like it was holding the entire empire together. And honestly, it probably was. No matter what else failed, no matter how terrible the food became, there would always be tea. Hot, bitter, strong enough to wake the dead, and served in quantities that could probably float a destroyer. The Soviets, meanwhile, approached nutrition with the same grim determination they brought to everything else. If it filled your stomach and didn't kill you immediately, it was dinner. Cabbage soup became not just a meal, but a way of life, sometimes the only thing standing between a soldier and starvation during those brutal winters. And the Japanese soldiers? They were expected to travel light and fight hard. often sustaining themselves on little more than rice balls and an almost supernatural level of discipline and determination. But here's the thing that makes this story deeply human. Food wasn't just fuel for these men. It was morale, comfort, a connection to home, and sometimes the thin line between hope and despair. A hot meal could lift spirits that artillery couldn't break. A cold tin of mysterious meat could crush morale faster than enemy propaganda. Some soldiers developed strange fondnesses for their rations, creating elaborate trading systems and improvised recipes. Others swore solemn oaths that if they survived the war, they'd never eat another cracker again. Many lay in foxholes dreaming not of victory parades or medals, but of simple things. Butter on real bread, fresh milk, and meals that their mothers used to make. Tonight, we're not talking about the grand strategies that won or lost battles. We're talking about Spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the very real war between soldiers and the strange, suspicious contents of their ration tins. Picture this. You're a young American GI who's just marched 10 grueling miles through mud that seems to have its own gravitational pull. You've been shot at approximately 6 times today, though you stopped counting after the third near miss whistled past your helmet. You haven't seen anything resembling a flush toilet in what feels like several geological epochs, and your stomach is making sounds that could legitimately be classified as a new form of artillery. Your salvation? A small cardboard box about the size of a hardcover book, weighing roughly 2 pounds and containing what the U.S. Army optimistically labeled as a complete meal. This, my friends, was the K ration, a compact, calorie-packed miracle of American mass production designed by people who had clearly never actually eaten one themselves. The K ration came in 3 delightful varieties: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, each one a carefully calculated exercise in nutritional adequacy and culinary disappointment. These boxes were engineered with the precision of a Swiss watch and all the gastronomic appeal of cardboard seasoned with government-issued optimism. Let's start with breakfast, shall we? The morning K ration kicked things off with a can of ham and eggs, a substance that bore roughly the same relationship to actual ham and eggs that a photograph bears to the Grand Canyon. The texture was something between Spam and drywall compound, with a color that defied both nature and good sense. Alongside this protein adventure, you'd find crackers so hard they could probably stop small caliber bullets, a packet of instant coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a dirty sock, and powdered lemonade, because nothing says balanced breakfast like citrus-flavored powder mixed with whatever water you could scrounge up. Oh, and let's not forget the accessories. A couple of sticks of gum that had the consistency of chalk, 4 cigarettes, because apparently nicotine was considered an essential nutrient, and, this is my personal favorite, exactly 1 sheet of toilet paper. Just one. As if the U.S. Army was sending a very clear message about portion control and resource management. Lunch didn't represent an improvement so much as a lateral move into different territory of culinary despair. You might receive cheese spread that contained more chemicals than actual cheese, another stack of those jaw-shattering biscuits that could probably be repurposed as emergency building materials, and a chocolate bar so dense it could double as armor plating. No spoon included, naturally. You were expected to excavate your lunch using your bayonet, a stick, or pure determination born of hunger. But dinner was where the K ration truly came into its own. The evening meal typically featured meat and beans, which looked like the scene of a very small, very beige crime that had been sealed in a can for your protection. The meat part was largely theoretical, and the beans had a texture that suggested they'd given up on life sometime during the canning process. You'd get more crackers, more gum, and if you were very, very lucky, if you'd been good and said your prayers and written home to your mother, you might find a tiny fruit bar that tasted like someone had whispered the word apple over a piece of compressed sawdust. Despite their complete lack of anything resembling flavor,
K-rations were actually nutritional marvels when you looked at the science. Each daily allotment provided roughly 3,000 calories, packed with protein, fat, carbohydrates, vitamins, and just enough variety to ensure you didn't accidentally enjoy any of it. The Army had calculated exactly what the human body needed to function in combat conditions, and they delivered it with the efficiency of a postal service and all the charm of a tax audit. The trading economy that developed around K-rations was fascinating to observe. Troops swapped components like Depression-era baseball cards, developing complex exchange rates, cigarettes for chocolate, cheese spread for crackers, anything to avoid the ham and egg trauma. A soldier might trade his entire breakfast allocation just to dodge that particular culinary landmine. But every now and then, just often enough to keep hope alive, you'd find a genuine treasure in your K-ration. A real Hershey's chocolate bar, not the military-issue concrete masquerading as candy, but actual honest-to-goodness chocolate. For one glorious bite, you weren't crouched in a muddy foxhole listening for incoming artillery. You were back home, maybe sharing a soda with your sweetheart, maybe sitting on your front porch watching the sunset over fields that nobody was shooting at. Those moments made the rest of the K-ration tolerable. Not good, let's not get carried away, but tolerable. Because sometimes survival isn't about finding something delicious. It's about finding something that reminds you why survival matters in the first place. So yes, the K-ration was dry, oddly geometric, and tasted like industrialized warfare. But in the end, it was the fuel that helped power victory in the largest conflict in human history, one questionable meat product at a time.
If the K-ration was the Army's attempt at a complete meal, then the D-ration was their idea of emergency survival disguised as a candy bar. And when I say disguised, I mean it in the same way that a brick might be disguised as a pillow if you squinted really hard and had recently suffered a severe head injury. The D-ration looked innocent enough, wrapped like a chocolate bar, sized like a chocolate bar, and issued to soldiers as emergency chocolate. But that's where any resemblance to actual chocolate ended, because this wasn't your grandmother's sweet treat. This was chocolate that had been engineered by the U.S. Army in coordination with the Hershey Company to accomplish three very specific goals. First, it absolutely could not melt, even in tropical heat that would reduce a normal candy bar to brown soup. Second, it had to last practically forever without spoiling, surviving everything from Arctic winters to desert summers. And third, and this is where it gets interesting, it had to taste terrible enough that soldiers wouldn't eat it unless they were actually starving. You read that correctly. The military specifically requested that this chocolate bar be unappetizing, so troops wouldn't consume their emergency rations during moments of mere hunger rather than genuine survival situations. Mission accomplished, gentlemen. Mission thoroughly, completely accomplished. The D-ration was roughly the size and weight of a deck of cards, but with the density of a small anvil. The ingredients were technically edible: chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and a bit of cocoa fat. But the result was a brown brick that could serve double duty as a weapon, a tool, or emergency construction material. Some soldiers swore it was harder whether it was in their packs or in their digestive systems. The manufacturing process was designed to create a product that could withstand the kind of abuse that military equipment routinely endured. These bars had to survive being dropped from aircraft, buried in foxholes, soaked in rain, frozen solid, and baked in desert heat, all while maintaining their structural integrity. And they did. Oh, how they did. Some D-rations probably outlasted the soldiers who carried them. The eating experience was memorable. Biting into a D-ration without proper preparation could lead to dental emergencies. The chocolate was so hard that attempting to chew it was like attacking a piece of mahogany with your molars. Veterans developed various techniques for consumption. Some tried grating it into hot water to make a sort of chocolate soup. Others would hold chunks in their mouths until body heat slowly softened them into something approaching edibility. A few enterprising souls reportedly used D-rations to hammer tent stakes, which says everything you need to know about their consistency. But here's what's remarkable. Despite being harder than most building materials and tasting like someone had mixed cocoa powder with military discipline, the D ration contained about 600 calories of genuine nutrition. For a soldier trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from supply lines, or stuck in a foxhole for days with nothing but ammunition and bad decisions, those 600 calories could mean the difference between making it home and becoming another casualty statistic. The psychological impact was almost as important as the nutritional content. Knowing you had emergency food, even terrible emergency food, provided a form of insurance against desperation. It was a small piece of security that fit in your pocket, a backup plan that weighed less than a hand grenade but could be more valuable than a week's worth of ammunition. Stories from the Pacific Theater tell of soldiers who survived for days on nothing but D rations and rainwater, and while they emerged from the experience with a lifelong aversion to chocolate, they did emerge. The bars kept them functional when everything else had gone wrong, when supply drops were impossible, when the only choice was between eating military-grade chocolate and not eating at all. The Army eventually recognized that feeding troops chocolate that required specialized equipment to consume might not be optimal for morale. Later iterations of the D ration were slightly softer and marginally more edible, though edible in this context should be understood as won't require surgical intervention to remove from your teeth. To this day, the D ration remains a legend in military circles, not as a beloved treat, but as proof of human adaptability and the Army's unique ability to take something universally loved, chocolate, and transform it into something that could serve as emergency ballast. Veterans who survived on D rations have a particular look in their eyes when you mention chocolate bars, a mixture of gratitude and trauma that speaks to experiences civilian confectioners could never imagine. So the next time someone tells you that chocolate makes everything better, remember the D ration, the bar that proved them spectacularly, memorably wrong, while somehow managing to keep soldiers alive in the process.
If the K ration was survival food and the D ration was edible punishment, then the field kitchen represented something almost magical in a soldier's world. The tantalizing possibility of eating something warm, recently cooked, and only mildly soul-crushing. These mobile cooking units, affectionately known among the troops as rolling misery carts, were the military's valiant attempt at providing hot meals on the go. Picture, if you will, a large metal contraption that looked like someone had crossbred a covered wagon with an industrial boiler and taught it to follow trucks around battlefields. These field kitchens were essentially restaurants on wheels, if restaurants were run by overworked army cooks, served food to people who hadn't showered in weeks, and operated under the constant threat of enemy artillery. The kitchen itself was an impressive piece of military engineering. A trailer equipped with large cooking pots, steam tables, prep areas, and storage compartments, all designed to feed hundreds of hungry soldiers in conditions that would make civilian health inspectors weep openly. These units could theoretically produce hot meals anywhere there was level ground, fresh water, and a reasonable expectation that enemy bombers wouldn't interrupt dinner service. The cooks, bless their hearts, worked miracles with whatever ingredients the supply chain managed to deliver. They churned out industrial-sized vats of stew, beans, gravy-like substances that defied both physics and good taste, and enough coffee to power an entire infantry division through a mild existential crisis. The portions were generous, the temperature was usually hot, and the nutritional value was adequate. The flavor, however, remained a subject of considerable debate. Meals were served cafeteria-style, with soldiers lining up with their trusty mess kits, metal trays that looked like they belonged in a laboratory experiment about the effects of industrial design on human dignity. You'd shuffle forward in line, extending your mess kit toward the serving soldiers who would ladle out portions with military precision. One scoop of mystery stew, one suspicious glance, and a firm directive to move along to the next station. The menu depended heavily on geography and supply line efficiency. In Europe, you might be fortunate enough to receive something approaching recognizable food, creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately and permanently renamed by the troops as SOS, though most soldiers used a considerably less polite word than stuff. The dish consisted of a white sauce containing what were optimistically described as beef pieces,
served over bread that had the structural integrity of cardboard and roughly the same flavor profile. In the Pacific Theater, where supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, the menu became more creative. Rice featured prominently, often accompanied by bits of what might have been meat if you approached it with sufficient optimism and didn't ask too many questions. Hot dog fragments swimming in mysterious broth were considered a delicacy, and fresh vegetables were so rare that discovering one could trigger celebrations rivaling those reserved for enemy retreats. But coffee, coffee was sacred. It didn't matter what else went wrong, what supply drops failed to materialize, or what military disasters befell the unit. If there was hot water in coffee grounds, there would be coffee. It was strong enough to dissolve paint, bitter enough to make grown men reconsider their life choices, and brewed in quantities sufficient to keep an entire battalion alert and reasonably hostile. The field kitchen experience was about more than just food, though. It represented one of the few moments in a soldier's day when you could sit down, take a breath, and pretend for a few minutes that you were somewhere resembling civilization. You might be perched on a helmet, a rock, or a piece of debris that used to be someone's house, eating beans from a metal tray in the middle of a war zone, but you were eating something hot. The conversations around these impromptu dining areas were remarkable for their normalcy. Soldiers would complain about the food with the enthusiasm of restaurant critics, swap stories about home, debate the merits of different rations, and create elaborate theories about what mystery ingredient might be lurking in the evening stew. It was community built around shared suffering and mutual sustenance. When the field kitchens were functioning properly, when supplies arrived on schedule, when enemy activity didn't force rapid evacuations, when everything went according to plan, they provided something approaching comfort food. Not comfort in the sense of your mother's home cooking, but comfort in knowing that someone, somewhere in the military hierarchy, still cared enough to try feeding you something that required actual cooking. In a world of chaos, bullets, and uncertainty, field kitchen meals represented a brief victory of civilization over circumstances, one ladle of questionable stew at a time.
At the dawn of World War II, German soldiers marched into battle with something that would become increasingly rare as the conflict progressed: actual food that resembled meals their grandmothers might have prepared. The early Wehrmacht rations were, by wartime standards, remarkably civilized, a reflection of German military efficiency and the nation's confidence that this war, like their previous victories, would be brief, decisive, and concluded in time for Christmas dinner. The standard German soldier's pack in 1939 contained provisions that would make soldiers from other armies genuinely envious. There was real rye bread, dark, hearty, substantial bread that could sustain a man through long marches and longer battles. There were actual sausages, Metwurst and Leberwurst, that carried the authentic flavors of German butcher shops. Butter, cheese, marmalade, and coffee rounded out a ration system that assumed soldiers should eat like human beings rather than merely survive like pack animals. The psychology behind these rations was fascinating. German military doctrine emphasized the importance of morale, and they understood that well-fed soldiers fought harder, complained less, and maintained unit cohesion better than troops subsisting on emergency provisions. Each soldier was expected to carry his own food for several days, which represented a significant weight burden when combined with weapons, ammunition, and equipment. But German confidence in rapid victory made this seem like a reasonable trade-off. Field kitchens supported the system with impressive efficiency. These mobile units could produce steaming pots of authentic German stews, boiled meats, and dumplings when circumstances permitted. The food was warm, familiar, and psychologically comforting, a taste of homeland served in foreign fields. Soldiers often wrote home about the quality of their meals, expressing genuine satisfaction with their military provisions. Breakfast might consist of that wonderful dark rye bread slathered with real butter and jam, accompanied by ersatz coffee, though in the early war years, even the coffee substitutes were of decent quality. Lunch could feature tinned meat, cheese, and perhaps a boiled potato or three.
Dinner, if you were fortunate enough to be near a functioning field kitchen, might include genuine soup or stew made from ingredients that had been alive recently. The sausage culture was particularly important to German soldiers. These preserved meats were not just nutritious, but culturally significant, connecting men far from home to traditions that stretched back generations. The aroma of German sausage in a field kitchen could boost morale as effectively as news of military victories. But here's where the story takes its inevitable turn toward the dark realities of extended warfare. As German armies pushed deeper into Russia, as supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of hostile territory, as the Royal Navy's blockade tightened around German supply routes, the quality of military rations began to reflect the deteriorating fortunes of the Reich itself. By 1942, that excellent bread was increasingly adulterated with fillers, sawdust, straw flour, potato starch, and whatever else could be ground into powder and mixed into dough. German soldiers joked grimly that their bread could double as helmet padding, and given its increasing density, this might not have been entirely humor. The bread that had once sustained German confidence now served mainly as a reminder of what had been lost. Real butter disappeared, replaced by ersatz margarine that was somehow both oily and chalky simultaneously. It was a pale, tasteless grease that satisfied neither nutritional needs nor psychological comfort. Coffee became a cruel joke. Roasted acorns, chicory, sugar beet, and barley ground up and brewed into a liquid that smelled like despair and tasted like something that had been filtered through an old boot. The beloved sausages that had connected soldiers to home underwent their own tragic transformation. First, horse meat began appearing in the mix, then turnip filler. Eventually, some sausages contained up to 40% plant material, creating a product that bore the same relationship to traditional German sausage that propaganda bears to truth. German soldiers who had begun the war eating better than most of their enemies found themselves subsisting on rations that couldn't sustain a dachshund, let alone men fighting in the brutal Russian winter. The psychological impact was devastating. Food that had once represented German efficiency and care for their soldiers now served as a daily reminder of systematic failure. Veterans of the Eastern Front would later describe the cruel irony of their situation. They had started the war as the best-equipped, best-fed army in the world, only to find themselves reduced to boiling shoe leather and bartering with locals for scraps that enemy soldiers wouldn't feed to their dogs. The transformation of German military rations from excellent to execrable paralleled the larger trajectory of German military fortunes, a decline that was visible, measurable, and tasted in every disappointing meal. If there was a place where the concept of a decent meal went to die during World War II, it was the Eastern Front, that vast, frozen, utterly merciless theater stretching thousands of miles from Berlin to the deepest reaches of the Soviet Union. Here, the logistical challenge of feeding armies wasn't just difficult. It was the equivalent of trying to run a restaurant chain across an entire continent while being shot at, bombed, and occasionally eaten by wolves. The Eastern Front represented the collision between German military ambition and the brutal realities of geography, climate, and distance. Supply lines that had worked perfectly well for rapid campaigns in Western Europe simply snapped under the strain of supporting armies scattered across distances that made the conquest of France look like a weekend camping trip. German soldiers who had once dined on real sausage and hearty rye bread found themselves crouched in snowdrifts, their fingers too numb to properly open cans of food that might have been edible if they hadn't frozen solid hours earlier. The morning ritual of trying to thaw your breakfast over a small fire while enemy snipers took potshots at you became a grim meditation on the relationship between survival and dignity. Meals on the Eastern Front often consisted of hot water with a few potato peels floating in it, and that was on good days. On bad days, it was just water, frozen solid by the time it reached the front lines. Bread arrived moldy when it arrived at all. The meat rations that appeared on supply manifests existed mainly in the imaginations of quartermaster clerks hundreds of miles away. The soldiers developed a dark humor around their rations. They would heat canned meat products over engine blocks, assuming they could get the engines started in temperatures that made steel brittle. They learned to sniff their way through mystery meat whose labels had long since worn away, playing a culinary version of Russian roulette where the stakes were food poisoning instead of bullets. Winter transformed eating into a survival skill that required engineering knowledge. Snow had to be boiled for drinking water, but melting snow lowered your core temperature. Canned food had to be thawed carefully to avoid burning your mouth on metal while the contents remained frozen. Some soldiers discovered that eating snow out of desperation, which seemed logical when you're surrounded by the stuff, actually accelerated hypothermia. Then there were the rats. Bold, fat, and suspiciously well-fed rats that seemed to have access to better nutrition than the soldiers themselves. Some units resorted to hunting and cooking these unwelcome tent mates, while others viewed them as competition for the same meager scraps. The sight of a well-fed rat became a source of dark envy among men who were slowly starving in one of the richest agricultural regions of Europe. The psychology of constant hunger created its own economy of desperation. Soldiers traded cigarettes for breadcrumbs, uniform buttons for sugar, socks for half a boiled potato. A single spoonful of jam could trigger fights between men who had fought side by side for months. Chocolate, when it appeared, was treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. German field commanders quickly learned that hungry soldiers weren't just less effective fighters, they were less effective human beings. Malnutrition affected judgment, reaction time, resistance to disease, and morale in ways that no amount of military discipline could overcome. Men who had been trained to follow orders without question began making survival decisions that prioritized their next meal over their next mission. The cruel irony was that they were fighting in some of the most agriculturally productive territory in the world, yet they were starving. Ukrainian wheat fields stretched to the horizon, but the grain was either destroyed by retreating Soviet forces, commandeered for German civilian populations, or simply impossible to harvest and process under combat conditions. Soviet scorched earth tactics meant that German armies advanced through landscapes where everything edible had been systematically destroyed or evacuated. Wells were poisoned, livestock driven away, grain stores burned. The land that was supposed to feed the German war machine became a frozen wasteland that consumed German soldiers. Veterans of the Eastern Front would later describe a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from combat, but from the constant, grinding hunger that made every action, loading a rifle, digging a foxhole, simply staying alert, exponentially more difficult. They fought not just against enemy soldiers, but against their own bodies' increasing inability to function on subsistence rations that wouldn't have sustained prisoners of war. On the Eastern Front, every meal became a small victory against impossible circumstances. Every calorie a tactical advantage in a war where logistics mattered more than courage, and where the difference between eating and not eating could determine who lived to see another frozen dawn.
While German troops on the Eastern Front were slowly starving on ersatz rations and frozen mystery meat, Soviet soldiers were developing what might generously be called a philosophical approach to nutrition. If it filled your stomach and didn't kill you immediately, it qualified as dinner. The Red Army's approach to feeding its troops was as stark and uncompromising as everything else about the Soviet war effort. Basic, brutal, and built around the assumption that soldiers could endure almost anything if the cause was righteous enough. The official Soviet ration was a study in Spartan simplicity. Black bread formed the cornerstone of every meal. Dense, dark, coarse bread made from whatever grain could be procured and processed under wartime conditions. This wasn't artisanal sourdough. It was compressed nutrition designed to keep a man alive and fighting. The bread was strictly rationed, with portions that could fit in your palm and disappear in 2 bites if you weren't careful about pacing yourself. Cabbage soup, shi, became the unofficial national dish of the Red Army, and for good reason. Cabbage was hearty, stored well,
and could be prepared in massive quantities without requiring sophisticated cooking techniques. Soviet field kitchens produced enormous vats of cabbage-based soup that varied wildly in quality depending on what else could be scrounged to add to the pot. On good days, you might find bits of potato or carrot floating in the broth. On bad days, it was essentially cabbage-flavored water with a few leaves for texture. The soup became such a constant in Soviet military life that soldiers joked they could smell cabbage in their sleep and dreamed of becoming turnips just to escape the endless cycle of cabbage-based meals. But joking aside, that soup provided warmth, hydration, and at least some vitamins to men fighting in conditions that would challenge the survival instincts of Arctic wildlife. Buckwheat porridge, kasha, provided another staple, though provided might be an optimistic term. When kasha was available, it was filling and nutritious. When it wasn't, which was frequently, soldiers made do with whatever grain substitutes could be found or improvised. The porridge was usually unsweetened, often undercooked, and sometimes had a texture that suggested the buckwheat had given up on life sometime during the cooking process. Meat existed primarily as a theoretical concept, supported by official documentation rather than actual experience. When meat did appear in Red Army rations, it was typically salted to the point where eating it required serious commitment and access to large quantities of water. The salt content was so extreme that soldiers sometimes used meat rations as seasoning rather than attempting to consume them directly. Tea was another constant, though tea in this context meant hot liquid that might have encountered actual tea leaves at some point in its preparation process. More often, it was hot water with whatever could be found to give it color and the suggestion of flavor: tree bark, dried herbs, or simply the memory of better times when real tea existed. Soviet soldiers routinely entered combat undernourished and overstressed, carrying rations that were supposed to last several days, but often had to stretch much longer when supply lines were disrupted by enemy action, weather, or the simple impossibility of moving food across battlefields measured in hundreds of miles. But here's what's remarkable about the Soviet military nutrition system. It worked, after a fashion. Not because the food was good, it wasn't, but because Soviet soldiers had been trained to view suffering as a form of patriotic duty. The culture of endurance that had helped Russian peasants survive centuries of harsh winters and brutal rulers proved remarkably adaptable to military conditions. When official rations failed entirely, which happened with disturbing regularity, Soviet soldiers became extraordinarily resourceful foragers. They dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, shot whatever wildlife could be found, and developed trading relationships with local civilians when circumstances permitted. Some units established informal agreements with German prisoners, exchanging silence for food in arrangements that both sides pretended didn't exist. The psychological approach to hunger was uniquely Soviet. Where German soldiers might write home complaining about their rations, Soviet soldiers were more likely to mention food shortages as evidence of their dedication to the cause. Suffering wasn't just endured, it was embraced as proof of communist virtue and resistance to fascist oppression. Field conditions on the Soviet side were harsh, even by Eastern Front standards. Soldiers cooked in helmets, boiled cabbage over small fires that might attract enemy attention, and shared meals that wouldn't have satisfied a single person under normal circumstances among entire squads of hungry men. But somehow, sustained by cabbage soup, black bread, and an ideological commitment that turned starvation into a weapon against fascism, the Red Army not only survived, but eventually prevailed. They proved that sometimes what feeds a soldier isn't calories, it's conviction seasoned with just enough cabbage to keep the body functioning.
If World War II had been judged solely on the basis of culinary achievement, the British Army might have been forced to surrender to its own menu before the Germans ever fired a shot. British military rations represented a triumph of stoic endurance over flavor, a daily exercise in choosing duty over gastronomy that somehow managed to fuel an empire's finest hour while simultaneously testing the limits of human tolerance for aggressively bland food.
The foundation of British military nutrition rested on what soldiers came to call the sacred trinity: tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Of these, tea was unquestionably the most important, not just as a beverage, but as a form of liquid morale that could transform the bleakest circumstances into something approaching civilization. British soldiers brewed tea with the dedication of religious acolytes performing sacred rituals. They brewed it in tin mugs, mess tins, helmets, cooking pots, and anything else that could hold hot water without leaking too dramatically. Sometimes there was no milk, no sugar, no dignity, just hot brown water and the kind of desperate hope that keeps empires functioning during their darkest moments. But that tea provided something more valuable than nutrition. It provided a connection to home, to routine, to the idea that somewhere in this chaos, normal life still existed. The hardtack biscuits that accompanied every British meal were engineered to outlast both the war and the soldiers eating them. These dense, chalky squares had the structural integrity of roofing tiles and roughly the same flavor profile. They were so durable that soldiers used them as makeshift plates, writing surfaces, and emergency building materials. Many veterans claimed their dental problems stemmed not from combat injuries, but from repeated attempts to bite through regulation-issue biscuits. Eating hardtack required strategy. You could try gnawing directly on the biscuit, though this approach risked dental damage that could sideline you longer than enemy shrapnel. You could soak it in tea until it achieved something approaching edibility, though this often produced a soggy mass that resembled wallpaper paste more than food. Or you could embrace the challenge and treat each biscuit as a test of character, a daily reminder that British resolve could overcome any obstacle, including British food. Then came the bully beef, tin corned beef that looked like an autopsy sample and had the consistency of congealed regret. It was salty, oily, and could be consumed hot, cold, or with the appropriate level of emotional detachment that military service tends to cultivate. Bully beef could be sliced, fried, diced, mashed, or simply stared at until your appetite retreated to a safe distance. The standard British ration also included powdered eggs that bore no resemblance to anything that had ever emerged from a chicken, tinned jam with enough sugar content to achieve structural adhesion, and assorted preserved foods that arrived in containers requiring tools, determination, and occasionally divine intervention to open. British field kitchens, when circumstances permitted their operation, could provide hot meals that represented significant improvements over cold rations, though significant should be understood relatively. Stews were possible, as were various preparations involving whatever ingredients could be procured, traded, or liberated from local sources. But regardless of what else was available, there was always tea. The psychological importance of tea in British military culture cannot be overstated. Shells could fall, supply lines could be cut, entire armies could retreat in disorder, but if there was hot water and something that had once been near actual tea leaves, there would be a proper brew. Veterans describe the ritual of tea preparation as a form of meditation, a brief pause in the chaos that allowed men to remember they were still human beings rather than simply military assets. British soldiers developed a remarkable tolerance for their rations, accepting them with the kind of resigned dignity that characterized the British approach to most forms of suffering. They complained about the food with the enthusiasm of restaurant critics, but they ate it with the determination of people who understood that survival sometimes requires consuming things that would make civilian health inspectors weep. The trading economy around British rations was less elaborate than in other armies, perhaps because there was less worth trading. But soldiers still bartered jam for cigarettes, biscuits for tinned meat, and occasionally managed to procure fresh food through relationships with local civilians or captured enemy supplies. What sustained British forces wasn't the quality of their rations, but the strength of their tea-fueled stoicism. They had learned to find comfort not in flavor, but in routine, not in abundance, but in the simple reliability of knowing that however terrible things became, there would always be tea. In the end, British military rations proved that an army could fight effectively on stubbornness alone, seasoned with just enough tea to keep the empire from collapsing into a pile of hardtack kerms and wounded pride.
In the Imperial Japanese Army, the relationship between food and military service transcended mere nutrition to become a philosophy of endurance that would challenge modern understanding of human limitations. Japanese soldiers were taught that self-denial was not just virtuous, but essential to their identity as warriors, which proved remarkably convenient for a military supply system that was about to fail spectacularly across the Pacific theater. The standard Japanese field ration reflected both cultural traditions and strategic necessities. At its core was white rice, the foundation of Japanese cuisine and the symbolic heart of the soldiers' connection to homeland. Accompanying the rice were barley for bulk, dried fish for protein, pickled plums, umeboshi, for their preservative qualities and supposed medicinal benefits, concentrated soy sauce, and occasionally a few hard candies that represented the extent of military indulgence. When properly organized and efficiently delivered, these rations could sustain a soldier for several days. The portions were compact, culturally familiar, and designed to provide essential nutrition without unnecessary weight. Early in the war, Japanese units carried multi-day supplies in neat packages wrapped in wax paper or stored in metal containers that looked organized, efficient, and thoroughly thought out. But then they encountered the jungle. The tropical climates of New Guinea, Burma, Guadalcanal, and countless other Pacific islands transformed Japanese rations from adequate sustenance into exercises in biological warfare conducted by humidity and insects. Rice that was supposed to remain dry and edible became moldy paste within days of exposure to jungle conditions. The carefully preserved fish developed its own ecosystem of decay. Metal containers rusted through, wax paper disintegrated, and what had been neat, efficient rations became science experiments in accelerated decomposition. More catastrophically, Japanese military logistics proved utterly inadequate for the distances and conditions of Pacific warfare. Supply lines that had functioned adequately for campaigns in Manchuria and China simply collapsed when stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Ships carrying food supplies were sunk by submarines, intercepted by enemy forces, or diverted to more pressing military needs. Many Japanese units found themselves cut off from resupply for weeks or months, with no alternative but to subsist on whatever the hostile environment might provide. Foraging in the Pacific jungles was an exercise in optimistic toxicology. Soldiers attempted to eat plants they couldn't identify, fruits that might or might not be poisonous, and roots that bore unpredictable relationships to actual nutrition. Some discoveries were merely unpalatable, others caused hallucinations, violent illness, or worse. The jungle was lush and green and completely indifferent to human survival needs. When plant life proved inadequate, Japanese soldiers turned to hunting whatever moved. Lizards, insects, birds, snakes, and rats all became potential protein sources for men desperate enough to risk the unknown. Stories survive of soldiers creating soup from boiled grass and boot leather, not because it provided significant nutrition, but because it gave their stomachs something to process and their minds something to focus on besides starvation. The psychological dimension of Japanese military nutrition was perhaps more remarkable than the physical. Japanese soldiers had been trained from childhood to view hardship as character building, suffering as purification, and deprivation as evidence of spiritual strength. This cultural conditioning proved both advantageous and devastating in combat conditions. On one hand, Japanese troops displayed extraordinary resilience in the face of conditions that broke soldiers from other armies. They continued fighting when adequately supplied forces would have surrendered or retreated. They maintained unit cohesion and military discipline even while slowly starving. Their ability to endure physical deprivation became legendary among both allies and enemies.
On the other hand, this cultural acceptance of suffering prevented Japanese military leadership from acknowledging the severity of supply problems until entire units had been reduced to ineffectiveness through malnutrition. Soldiers who should have reported critical food shortages instead endured them silently, viewing their hunger as a test of worthiness rather than a logistical failure requiring immediate attention. The few occasions when Japanese soldiers encountered adequate food, captured enemy supplies, successful foraging, or rare successful resupply were treated with almost religious reverence. A spoonful of rice, a piece of dried fish, or a single hard candy could provide psychological sustenance far beyond its caloric content. Medical records from Japanese units reveal the horrific progression of malnutrition-related diseases, beriberi, scurvy, dysentery, and conditions that had no names but resulted from the human body attempting to function on inadequate nutrition for extended periods of time. Soldiers dropped not from enemy fire, but from the slow collapse of biological systems pushed beyond their limits. Yet throughout the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers continued fighting, not because they were well fed, but because they had been taught that a warrior's strength came not from his stomach, but from his spirit, and that enduring the impossible was simply another form of service to the emperor. In the end, the Imperial Japanese Army proved that human determination could carry soldiers far beyond what adequate nutrition might have achieved, though the price of that lesson was measured in thousands of lives lost, not to bullets, but to the slow, grinding starvation of forgotten supply lines.
The jungles of the Pacific Theater looked like paradise from a distance. Lush green canopies stretching to every horizon, dense vegetation that seemed to promise abundance. The kind of tropical landscape that travel brochures would later use to sell vacation packages to people who had never tried to survive there with a rifle and a prayer. But for soldiers on both sides of the Pacific War, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a source of food. It was a leafy green death trap with humidity problems and a serious attitude. What appeared to be nature's abundance was actually nature's elaborate practical joke, designed to starve humans while providing excellent habitat for everything that wanted to eat humans instead. The fundamental problem with jungle survival was that everything looked edible, but very little actually was. Soldiers found themselves surrounded by fruits they couldn't identify, plants they didn't recognize, and roots that might provide nutrition or might provide an express ticket to the afterlife. Trial and error became a literally life and death process, where the error part could involve anything from violent digestive distress to complete nervous system shutdown. Japanese units, cut off from supply lines for weeks or months, became unwilling experts in tropical botany. They learned to identify which fruits were safe through methods that would horrify modern survivalists. Essentially, someone had to take the first bite, and everyone else waited to see what happened. Some discoveries were merely disappointing. Others caused hallucinations, paralysis, or death. The jungle was democratic in its hostility. It didn't care which army you belonged to. Foraging expeditions became exercises in controlled desperation. Soldiers would venture away from their positions, already weakened by hunger and disease, to search for anything that might be consumed without immediate fatal consequences. They dug for roots that might or might not be poisonous, climbed trees for fruits that might or might not be ripe, and investigated plants that might or might not be the tropical equivalent of poison ivy. The protein situation was particularly grim. While the jungle teemed with life, most of that life was either too small to provide meaningful nutrition, too fast to catch, or too dangerous to approach. Birds stayed high in the canopy, well beyond the reach of hungry soldiers. Large mammals were rare and shy. What remained were insects, reptiles, and the occasional unwary rodent.
Many Japanese soldiers developed elaborate theories about insect nutrition, convincing themselves that beetles provided essential proteins and that certain grubs were actually quite palatable if prepared properly. These theories were born more from necessity than scientific observation, but they provided psychological comfort even when they failed to provide adequate calories. The climate itself became an enemy of nutrition. Humidity that could reach 100% turned any stored food into biological experiments within hours. Metal containers rusted through, paper packages disintegrated, and even the most carefully preserved rations became breeding grounds for mold, bacteria, and insects. Soldiers learned to eat quickly because food that was edible in the morning might be dangerously contaminated by afternoon. Water presented its own challenges. While the jungle provided plenty of moisture, finding safe drinking water required constant vigilance. Streams might be contaminated with parasites. Rainwater could carry diseases, and stagnant pools were biological minefields. Soldiers had to balance the immediate need for hydration against the longer-term risks of waterborne illness. Disease followed malnutrition like a shadow. Soldiers weakened by inadequate nutrition became vulnerable to malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and tropical diseases that had no names but could kill as efficiently as enemy bullets. Medical supplies were as scarce as food, leaving units to treat serious illnesses with folk remedies and desperate improvisation. The psychological impact of jungle starvation was perhaps worse than the physical effects. Soldiers found themselves surrounded by what looked like abundance while slowly starving to death. The disconnect between appearance and reality created a form of environmental gaslighting that drove some men to make increasingly desperate decisions about what constituted food. Stories emerged of soldiers creating soup from boiled leaves and bark, not because these ingredients provided nutrition, but because the act of preparing and consuming something warm gave them psychological relief from the constant awareness of their own hunger. The ritual of cooking became more important than the actual food being cooked. Japanese units sometimes resorted to cannibalism during extended sieges, a horrifying testament to how completely the jungle could break down the boundaries between civilization and survival. These incidents weren't widespread, but they occurred often enough to become part of the whispered folklore of Pacific Theater veterans. Disease followed closely behind starvation. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, all worsened by malnutrition. Soldiers dropped not from bullets, but from hunger and infection, slowly and invisibly. The jungle didn't care which uniform you wore, which flag you fought under, or which god you prayed to. It didn't feed you. It didn't shelter you. It didn't offer comfort or mercy. It simply waited for you to get tired, to make one mistake too many, to finally succumb to the combination of heat, hunger, and desperation. And then, quietly and efficiently, it consumed you, just like everything else that fell within its green embrace.
War may destroy cities and shatter civilizations, but it also unlocks a peculiar form of human creativity, the desperate, ingenious, occasionally brilliant art of making edible meals from military rations that were never intended to be enjoyed. Across every front of World War II, soldiers didn't just eat their rations. They negotiated with them, bargained with them, and sometimes performed actual miracles of culinary alchemy. These weren't trained chefs working with quality ingredients. These were hungry, exhausted, often terrified young men, armed with bayonets, mess kits, and the kind of determination that only comes from truly terrible food.
They bartered, swapped, stretched, crushed, fried, and sometimes worshipped the better components of their military meals, turning survival into a form of entertainment and occasionally transforming genuine punishment into something approaching nourishment. In American foxholes scattered across Europe and the Pacific, GIs developed an entire cuisine based on K-ration improvisation. They discovered that K-ration crackers, when crushed and mixed with powdered eggs and coffee creamer, could be fried over a small fire to create something resembling pancakes. The final product tasted like warm despair, seasoned with military-grade optimism, but it was hot, and in a world of cold, wet misery, hot counted for everything. Canned cheese became the foundation for elaborate cooking experiments. Soldiers learned to melt it into an oily paste over hot beans, creating what they optimistically called trench fondue. Spam was sliced, pan-fried, and stacked between biscuits to make what might generously be described as the world's saddest sandwich. Even chewing gum found new culinary applications, sealing leaky canteens or serving as currency to bribe fellow soldiers with extra cigarettes. British soldiers, armed with their indestructible hardtack biscuits and mystical jars of jam, created their own forms of edible engineering. The Jam Buddy sandwich involved smashing two rock-hard biscuits together with enough jam to create structural adhesion, then consuming the result before it could inflict permanent dental damage. One squad in North Africa became famous for mixing bully beef with dried fruit and calling it Desert Delight, a name that reflected either admirable optimism or complete psychological breakdown. Another enterprising unit named their nightly stew Stuff, because no one, including the cook, could identify what was actually in it anymore. The mystery became part of the appeal. Eating stuff was like participating in a daily lottery where the stakes were digestive comfort rather than money. On the Eastern Front, where resources were scarce and creativity was mandatory for survival, Soviet soldiers transformed military surplus into cooking equipment. Empty shell casings became soup pots, helmets doubled as cooking vessels, and anything with legs was fair game for the dinner menu. One legendary incident involved a stolen German sausage that was so prized it required 3 men to defend it from their own hungry comrades. Even the Japanese, working with the most limited supplies of any major army, found ways to repurpose their meager leftovers. Rice was refried with pickled vegetables to create onigiri-style cakes that provided both psychological comfort and minimal nutrition. Dried seaweed was hoarded like gold, used to flavor water when nothing else remained. Every grain of rice was precious, every drop of soy sauce a luxury to be savored. These weren't gourmet meals in any recognizable sense. They were acts of wartime alchemy, the transformation of military logistics into something approaching human cuisine. Field improvisation became a form of morale maintenance, turning not enough into this'll have to do, and making genuinely terrible foods slightly less terrifying through the simple act of preparation and creativity. The psychology behind these culinary experiments was as important as the nutrition they provided. When you're stuck in a trench, a jungle, or a bombed-out farmhouse, your mess kit becomes your kitchen, your bayonet becomes your cooking utensil, and your meal becomes a small victory against circumstances designed to crush human dignity. Soldiers discovered that the act of cooking, even terrible cooking with inadequate ingredients, provided a sense of control in situations where control was otherwise impossible. It was a way of maintaining humanity in inhuman conditions, of creating something personal and individual in a military system designed to eliminate personal preferences. The social aspect was equally important. Sharing improvised meals created bonds between soldiers that transcended rank, nationality, or background. Trading ration components became a form of communication, a way of expressing care for fellow soldiers without having to articulate emotions that military culture discouraged. These improvised recipes also served as entertainment during the long periods of boredom that characterized much of military life. Debates about the best way to prepare K-ration hash could consume entire evenings, providing mental stimulation and social interaction that helped maintain psychological health under impossible conditions. Most importantly, these culinary experiments represented hope. Every attempt to make military rations more palatable was an assertion that better days would come, that this was temporary, that someday they would return to kitchens where food was prepared with care and consumed with pleasure. Because when you're fighting for survival, sometimes the difference between giving up and carrying on can be found in the simple act of making something edible from ingredients that were never meant to nourish the human spirit.
Long after the guns fell silent, long after uniforms were folded away in attic boxes and medals were displayed in living room cabinets, one thing stayed with veterans of World War II with remarkable persistence: the food. Or more precisely, the complex, often traumatic relationship they developed with the substances they had been required to consume during the most formative years of their lives. For many soldiers, military rations became far more than simple sustenance. They became the backdrop to trauma, camaraderie, grief, boredom, and hope. Emotional experiences so intense that they permanently altered how these men related to food for the rest of their lives. A single bite of corned beef could instantly transport a veteran back to a foxhole in France. The smell of cabbage soup could trigger vivid memories of frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. A can of Spam wasn't just processed meat. It was a portal to specific moments in time when survival itself hung in the balance. The psychological power of these food memories was extraordinary in both its intensity and its persistence. American veterans would joke decades later about choking down a D ration like it owed them money, but beneath the humor lay genuine trauma. The memory of trying to bite through chocolate hard enough to crack teeth, of forcing down ham and eggs that tasted like salted cardboard, of making a single sheet of toilet paper last through unthinkable circumstances. These experiences left marks that lasted lifetimes. British troops developed their own catalog of food-related war stories, often told with the same dry humor that had sustained them through the conflict itself. Veterans would gather at pubs and swap tales of trying to trade hardtack biscuits with local civilians, only to be laughed at by people who recognized military rations as barely edible even by wartime standards. The shared experience of surviving on tea, bully beef, and sheer determination became a form of cultural identity that bound British veterans together long after the war ended. One Soviet veteran, interviewed decades after the war, claimed he couldn't eat bread for years after returning home, not because he hated it, but because bread had become sacred during the siege of Leningrad. Bread was life, he explained. After the war, eating bread felt like cheating, like I was taking food from someone who needed it more. The psychological relationship between survival and sustenance had been so fundamentally altered by wartime experience that normal eating felt emotionally impossible. Food became a marker of the boundaries between war and peace, between danger and safety, between desperation and normalcy. A fresh apple meant you were near a farm and possibly close to civilian life. A hot stew from a functioning field kitchen meant you weren't dying that particular day. Even terrible coffee carried profound meaning. It meant someone cared enough to boil water, that military organization was still functioning, that you were still part of something larger than your own survival. Then there were the care packages, those precious morale-boosting gifts from home that carried emotional weight far beyond their nutritional value. Chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, homemade cookies wrapped in letters from family. These weren't just treats. They were emotional lifelines connecting soldiers to a world beyond military rations and battlefield survival. Some soldiers hoarded care package items, rationing them out one tiny piece at a time to stretch hope across weeks or months of horror. Others shared everything immediately, using food as a way to build community and maintain human connections in circumstances designed to strip away individual identity. A few kept special items as talismans, carrying a piece of chocolate or a cookie for weeks without eating it,
drawing comfort from simply knowing it was there. The lingering effects of wartime nutrition extended far beyond emotional associations. Many veterans discovered that certain flavors, textures, or smells had become permanently embedded in their sensory memory. One GI claimed he could still smell Spam every time it rained, decades after the war ended. Another insisted that his nightmares occasionally featured powdered eggs as recurring characters, yellow and sinister, and somehow threatening in ways that defied rational explanation. These weren't simply amusing anecdotes about military food. They represented a fundamental truth about human psychology. When you eat under extreme stress, when every meal might be your last, when food becomes directly connected to survival rather than pleasure, those experiences become part of your identity in ways that peaceful meals never could. Veterans often described the strange duality of their relationship with military rations. They hated the food with genuine passion, but they also recognized it as the fuel that had kept them alive during humanity's darkest hour. Spam was disgusting, but Spam had helped win the war. K-rations were terrible, but K-rations had sustained them through the liberation of concentration camps and the defeat of fascism. Because when you eat in war, you're not just feeding your body, you're anchoring your existence in a world gone mad. You're trying to maintain your humanity while participating in the systematic destruction of human civilization. And that means every meal, however bland or bizarre, becomes part of the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you've survived. So the next time you casually grab a snack from your refrigerator, remember those soldiers cooking with nothing but firewood, bayonets, and determination born of desperation. For them, every bite was survival, and the taste of that survival never really faded.
The ink was barely dry on the United States Constitution when the young republic found itself brewing its first major domestic crisis, one that came not from foreign invasion or political coup, but from something far more potent and decidedly more America: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was financially devastated. The Revolutionary War had left the nation buried under a mountain of debt that threatened to crush the new government before it could properly establish itself. The federal treasury was essentially empty. State governments were struggling to pay their own obligations, and the entire experiment in democratic self-governance seemed to teeter on the edge of economic collapse. President George Washington and his brilliant but controversial Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, desperately needed a solution. Hamilton, ever the fiscal mastermind with an unshakable faith in the power of organized finance, proposed what seemed like a reasonable revenue measure: an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, with whiskey being by far the most common and profitable target. To the urban elites of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, the merchants, bankers, and educated professionals who formed the backbone of Federalist support, this tax sounded perfectly sensible. It would generate badly needed revenue, it would be paid primarily by people who chose to consume luxury goods, and it would help establish the federal government's authority to raise money through taxation, rather than simply borrowing. But out on the western frontier, in the remote valleys and mountainous regions where civilization gave way to wilderness, Hamilton's whiskey tax sounded like something very different. A deliberate slap in the face from the same kind of distant aristocratic authority they had just fought a bloody revolution to escape. In places like western Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and the Virginia backcountry, whiskey wasn't simply an alcoholic beverage consumed for pleasure or social lubrication. It was currency, commerce, and economic survival all rolled into a single amber liquid that could be stored, transported, and traded far more efficiently than the grain from which it was made. Frontier farmers faced a basic logistical problem that urban politicians couldn't understand or appreciate. When you lived hundreds of miles from the nearest real market, when roads were little more than muddy trails that became impassable for months at a time, when transporting bulk agricultural products required enormous effort for minimal profit, distillation became economic necessity rather than lifestyle choice. A farmer could take a ton of grain
and through the ancient alchemy of fermentation and distillation, transform it into a few gallons of whiskey that were worth many times the original crop's value, were far easier to transport, wouldn't spoil during long journeys, and could be traded for manufactured goods, services, or other necessities that frontier life required but couldn't provide. Whiskey had become the unofficial currency of the western frontier. Farmers paid their laborers in whiskey, traded whiskey for tools and supplies, used whiskey to pay debts and taxes to local authorities. Bartering whiskey for goods and services wasn't just common, it was the foundation of the entire frontier economy. So when the federal government announced that it was going to tax this essential economic activity, many frontier folk interpreted it not as a reasonable revenue measure, but as an attack on their way of life and a betrayal of the revolutionary principles they had fought to establish. To make matters significantly worse, the tax structure itself seemed deliberately designed to favor large commercial distillers while punishing small frontier producers. Large distilleries, the kind owned by wealthy urban investors, could afford to pay an annual flat fee that, when spread across high-volume production, represented a minimal per-gallon cost. But small-time distillers, the frontier farmers who might produce only a few dozen gallons per year, were required to pay tax on each gallon individually. This meant that the little guy, the subsistence farmer trying to convert his grain surplus into tradable currency, paid proportionately far more than wealthy commercial producers. It was in effect a regressive tax that hit hardest on the people least able to afford it and most dependent on whiskey production for their economic survival.
By 1792, the whiskey tax had transformed from an unpopular government policy into something approaching radioactive political material that threatened to ignite the entire western frontier. In the backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, opposition was rapidly evolving from scattered individual complaints into coordinated, organized defiance that bore uncomfortable similarities to the early stages of the American Revolution. Tax collectors venturing into frontier territories were becoming intimately familiar with two particular sounds: the unmistakable crash of breaking windows and the sharp crack of gunfire passing uncomfortably close to their heads. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated intimidation tactics designed to make federal tax collection impossible without triggering the kind of armed confrontation that might give the federal government excuse for military intervention. The western counties of Pennsylvania emerged as the epicenter of what many participants had begun calling outright rebellion against federal authority. But this wasn't a disorganized rabble of drunken farmers causing trouble on Saturday nights. These were carefully planned political gatherings held in taverns, private homes, and meeting halls where kegs of homemade whiskey stood alongside stacks of muskets, and the conversation moved seamlessly between revolutionary political theory and practical logistics of armed resistance. These meetings weren't simply opportunities for frontier folk to complain about government policy. They were organizing sessions where local communities formed militias, elected leaders, issued formal threats to federal officials, and passed their own resolutions condemning the whiskey tax as unconstitutional, illegitimate, and worthy of resistance by any means necessary. The rebels developed sophisticated systems of non-cooperation that went far beyond simple tax evasion. Communities refused to do business with anyone who paid the federal whiskey tax, creating economic pressure that reinforced political resistance. Federal sympathizers found themselves socially ostracized, economically boycotted, and sometimes physically threatened by neighbors who had once considered them friends. It was part political protest, part economic warfare, and part organized crime syndicate, all held together by shared hatred of federal authority and liberal amounts of the corn liquor that had started the entire conflict. The rebellion had its own internal logic, its own leadership structure, and its own escalating tactics that seemed to be building towards something much more serious than tax resistance. In 1793, the conflict escalated dramatically beyond mere intimidation and economic pressure. Tax collectors and anyone suspected of supporting federal authority were being ambushed, beaten, and publicly humiliated in ceremonies designed to demonstrate the powerlessness of distant government authority. One unfortunate federal supporter was captured by a rebel mob, forced to march through town with a sign reading "Coward" hanging around his neck, and subjected to ritualized public shaming that resembled nothing so much as Revolutionary War-era tar and feathering. The
The resemblance to colonial resistance against British authority was neither accidental nor subtle. Many of the whiskey rebels were veterans of the Revolutionary War who saw disturbing parallels between British taxation policies they had fought against and federal taxation policies they were now being asked to accept. The language of resistance, liberty, tyranny, taxation without representation, came naturally to men who had used those same words to justify armed rebellion against the British Crown. But there was a crucial difference between colonial resistance to British authority and frontier resistance to federal authority. This time, the government being resisted was theoretically their own government, created by their own constitution, administered by leaders they had theoretically helped elect. The philosophical justification for rebellion was much more complicated when the tyrants you were fighting were supposed to be your own elected representatives. The federal courts attempted to restore order through legal means rather than military means, issuing summons and warrants designed to bring rebel leaders to justice through normal judicial processes. But serving legal papers in regions where the local sheriff might be part of the rebel leadership, where federal authority was openly rejected, and where armed resistance was considered patriotic duty, proved to be essentially impossible. The affected regions were effectively slipping into a state of lawlessness that threatened not only federal revenue collection, but the basic principle that federal law was enforceable throughout American territory. Local officials either actively supported the rebellion or maintained careful neutrality that amounted to tacit support for tax resistance. President Washington, usually a model of calm deliberation, found himself confronting a crisis that struck at the heart of everything the new Constitution was supposed to accomplish. The Whiskey Rebellion was threatening not only public order and federal revenue, but the fundamental legitimacy of federal law itself. If the government couldn't enforce its own tax collection, what was the point of having a constitution? What was the point of having a federal government at all? Still, Washington resisted calls for immediate military intervention. He understood that using armed force against American citizens would be politically explosive and potentially counterproductive. Instead, he authorized federal commissioners to travel to the affected regions and attempt to negotiate a peaceful resolution with rebel leaders. But trying to conduct diplomatic negotiations with armed tax resistors proved about as effective as trying to serve afternoon tea in the middle of a bar fight. The rebels had already moved beyond the point where they were interested in compromise or accommodation. They had formed committees, held conventions, and in some cases begun discussing complete secession from the United States. They saw themselves not as criminals or traitors, but as patriots standing up to tyranny exactly as their revolutionary fathers had done 20 years earlier. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had evolved far beyond a simple tax protest into something that represented a fundamental challenge to the authority and legitimacy of the federal government. George Washington, the man who had led a successful revolution against distant authority just 2 decades earlier, now found himself in the extraordinary and deeply ironic position of preparing to lead an army against American citizens, the very people he had helped liberate from British tyranny. This wasn't going to be a minor police action involving a few dozen federal marshals dealing with isolated incidents of tax evasion. Washington made the unprecedented decision to mobilize more than 12,000 troops, a force nearly 3 times larger than the Continental Army he had commanded at the Battle of Trenton during the Revolutionary War. This massive federal army included state militia units from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, many composed of volunteers, but others essentially drafted into service. Think about the historical magnitude of this moment. The largest federal military force ever assembled in American history to that point wasn't marching against British redcoats, French armies, or Native American warriors. It was marching west across Pennsylvania to confront angry farmers armed with pitchforks, hunting rifles, and an intimate knowledge of local terrain that could make military operations extremely difficult and politically explosive. Alexander Hamilton, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic gesture or political theater, rode out with the army like some powdered wig version of a conquering general. He was absolutely thrilled by the opportunity to demonstrate federal power and establish precedents for strong central government authority. This was his moment to prove that the new American government had both the will and the capability to enforce its laws against violent resistance. For Hamilton, the Whiskey Rebellion represented everything he feared about popular democracy and decentralized government. In his view, the rebellion proved that ordinary citizens couldn't be trusted with too much political freedom, especially when that freedom was enhanced by alcohol consumption and reinforced by distance from civilizing urban influences. The rebellion wasn't just about taxes. It was about whether America would be governed by law or by mob rule. Washington himself was far more reluctant to use military force against fellow Americans, but he clearly understood the constitutional stakes involved. The rebellion wasn't simply about whiskey taxation. It was about whether the United States could function as a unified nation governed by federal law. If armed resistance could successfully intimidate federal tax collectors and nullify congressional legislation, then the Constitution might as well be used for starting campfires. The philosophical implications were staggering. If regional opposition could effectively veto federal policy through violence and intimidation, then the United States would become a loose confederation of semi-independent regions rather than a unified nation capable of governing itself effectively. The rebels weren't just challenging a specific tax policy, they were challenging the entire concept of federal authority. So, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president personally took command of troops in the field and led them toward armed confrontation with American citizens. Imagine the psychological impact of that moment. George Washington, the most famous and respected man in America, riding westward through the Allegheny Mountains, not to inspire revolution, but to crush one. His personal presence with the army sent an unmistakable message that reverberated far beyond the immediate military situation. This wasn't some routine law enforcement operation delegated to subordinate officials. This was the father of his country, personally leading federal forces against domestic rebellion. The symbolism was overwhelming. Rebellion against federal authority would be met not with negotiation or compromise, but with the full military power of the United States government. When the massive federal army finally approached the heart of rebel territory in western Pennsylvania, the response was both anticlimactic and psychologically devastating for the rebellion. The rebels, who had talked courageously in taverns about resisting federal tyranny and had successfully intimidated individual tax collectors, suddenly discovered they had far less appetite for armed confrontation with 12,000 federal troops led by George Washington himself. Most of the rebellion's leadership simply vanished. Some fled into the wilderness, others melted back into their normal roles as farmers and shopkeepers, and others adopted the time-honored strategy of claiming they had never heard of any rebellion and couldn't imagine what all the fuss was about. The great armed resistance that had threatened federal authority for months collapsed without firing a shot. There would be no climactic battle, no dramatic military confrontation, no heroic last stand by liberty-loving frontiersmen against federal tyranny. The army had marched hundreds of miles, mobilized thousands of troops, and spent enormous amounts of money to confront a rebellion that evaporated like morning mist the moment it was faced with serious consequences. But Washington's message had been delivered with crystal clarity. The federal government was no longer the weak, ineffective confederation that had existed under the Articles of Confederation. This was a government with real power, real authority, and real determination to enforce its laws throughout American territory. The rebellion was over, but the precedent it established would echo through American political culture for generations to come.
With the Whiskey Rebellion effectively smothered before a single federal shot had been fired in anger, the massive army that had marched across Pennsylvania began the long journey home. But the work of establishing federal authority wasn't quite finished. Now came the delicate and politically sensitive task of administering justice, determining punishment, and establishing legal precedents that would govern how future domestic insurrections would be handled. The military phase of the operation had been a complete success, so complete, in fact, that it had been almost embarrassingly easy.
But the legal aftermath would prove far more complex and politically significant than the brief, bloodless campaign that had preceded it. Federal authorities managed to capture a handful of individuals who could be characterized as rebellion leaders, though leaders might be an overly generous description for what were mainly unlucky men who had been caught by poor timing, inadequate hiding places, or insufficient warning about approaching federal troops. Many of the more prominent and genuinely radical agitators had successfully vanished into the western wilderness, where a federal authority was theoretical at best. What remained were approximately 20 prisoners who were transported to Philadelphia to stand trial for treason against the United States, a capital offense that could theoretically result in execution by hanging. The symbolic importance of these trials extended far beyond the fate of individual defendants. They would establish crucial legal precedents about the federal government's authority to prosecute domestic rebellion and define the boundaries between legitimate political dissent and treasonous resistance to federal law. The trials themselves, however, didn't unfold according to Alexander Hamilton's dramatic expectations or satisfy his desire for harsh punishment that would discourage future resistance to federal authority. The evidence against most defendants was surprisingly thin and difficult to prove in court. Many potential witnesses were afraid to testify, either because they feared retaliation from rebel sympathizers or because they harbored their own doubts about the legitimacy of federal tax policy. More significantly, the juries, composed of Pennsylvania citizens who were supposedly peers of the accused, proved notably reluctant to convict their neighbors of capital crimes for what many jurors privately considered understandable, if misguided, resistance to unfair taxation. The social and political divisions that had fueled the rebellion in the first place continued to influence the legal proceedings designed to resolve it. In the end, only 2 men were actually convicted of treason, and even those convictions came with significant judicial skepticism about both the evidence and the proportionality of the charges. These weren't dangerous revolutionary leaders or sophisticated political conspirators. They were poor farmers who had made unfortunate decisions during a period of community upheaval and political confusion. George Washington, drawing on his deep understanding of both political necessity and moral leadership, chose to exercise presidential mercy rather than federal vengeance. In a decision that surprised some supporters and relieved many critics, he issued full presidential pardons to both convicted rebels. His message was carefully calibrated. Yes, the federal government would enforce its laws and prosecute violent resistance, but it would not become a tyrannical force that crushed its own citizens under the heel of governmental power. This act of clemency proved to be as politically important as the original show of military force. Washington had demonstrated that the new federal government possessed both the strength to suppress domestic rebellion and the wisdom to temper justice with mercy. The United States would be a nation governed by law, but it would also be a nation that preserved space for human forgiveness and political reconciliation. The pardons sent a complex message that resonated throughout American political culture. Federal authority was real and would be enforced when necessary, but the government wouldn't become vindictive or oppressive in victory. This balance between strength and restraint, between law enforcement and political forgiveness, became a crucial precedent for how democratic governments could handle domestic opposition without sliding into authoritarianism. Alexander Hamilton, predictably, was disappointed by Washington's mercy. He had hoped for more dramatic punishment that would establish clearer boundaries around acceptable political behavior and create stronger deterrence against future challenges to federal authority. In Hamilton's view, the common people needed to understand that resistance to legitimate government policy would carry serious personal consequences. But Washington understood the deeper political dynamics at work. Legitimacy in a democratic system doesn't flow from the government's ability to crush opposition. It comes from the government's capacity to demonstrate that it can be both strong and just, both decisive and merciful, both powerful and restrained. The Whiskey Rebellion was over, but the constitutional and political precedents it established would echo through American history for generations. The United States had successfully passed its first major test of federal authority without collapsing into either anarchy or tyranny. The precedent was clear. Domestic rebellion would be suppressed, but the aftermath would be guided by justice rather than revenge. Still, important questions remained unanswered. Would future presidents exercise the same combination of force and forgiveness? Would mercy always follow displays of federal power? And most significantly, was this the end of frontier rebellion against federal authority, or merely the first chapter in a much longer story of regional resistance to central government control?
The guns had been holstered, the rebels pardoned, and the whiskey stills had quietly resumed their ancient alchemy in the hills of western Pennsylvania. But politically, the Whiskey Rebellion left behind a hangover that would persist for decades, fundamentally reshaping American political culture and accelerating the development of the first real political parties in the nation's history. The rebellion had proven beyond doubt that the federal government possessed the power to enforce its laws throughout American territory, but it had also ignited deep political divisions that had been smoldering beneath the surface of American politics since the ratification of the Constitution. The crisis had forced Americans to choose sides on fundamental questions about the nature of government, the relationship between federal and local authority, and the proper balance between order and liberty in a democratic society. At the heart of the post-rebellion political realignment were two completely incompatible visions of what America should become. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist allies, urban sophisticates who believed in strong central government, commercial development, financial innovation, and the kind of social order that required ordinary citizens to respect the authority of their educated betters. The Federalists saw the Whiskey Rebellion as vindication of their deepest fears about popular democracy and decentralized government. In their view, the rebellion proved that common people, especially those living in remote frontier regions, couldn't be trusted with too much political freedom. Without firm guidance from established institutions and educated leadership, democracy would inevitably degenerate into mob rule, violence, and chaos. On the other side were Thomas Jefferson and his Republican allies, who viewed the federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion with deep suspicion and growing alarm. They believed in the yeoman farmer as the backbone of American democracy, local control over government policy, and fierce resistance to the kind of centralized authority they had fought a revolution to escape. To the Jeffersonian Republicans, the federal march against western Pennsylvania wasn't a heroic defense of law and order. It was dangerous overkill that revealed the Federalist Party's authoritarian tendencies and contempt for ordinary Americans. Mobilizing 12,000 federal troops to suppress tax resistance by farmers with barrels of corn whiskey felt less like legitimate law enforcement and more like using a sledgehammer to swat flies. Thomas Jefferson, who had been serving as Washington's Secretary of State during the rebellion, didn't conceal his criticism of the federal response. Privately, he described the military expedition as a monarchical adventure that demonstrated how quickly American political leaders could slide back into the kind of tyrannical behavior they had supposedly rejected during the Revolution. Jefferson believed that Washington's show of force had been politically counterproductive, driving a wedge between the federal government and exactly the kind of independent-minded citizens who should have been natural supporters of American democracy. Instead of building popular support for federal authority, the rebellion's suppression had created martyrs and deepened the cultural divide between urban elites and rural communities. In the aftermath of the rebellion, something remarkable happened that validated Jefferson's analysis. The Republican Party began gaining significant traction, especially in frontier regions where distrust of federal authority had been fermenting like the whiskey that had triggered the crisis. The rebellion had failed militarily, but it succeeded spectacularly in galvanizing anti-federalist political sentiment. Out on the frontier, where memories of federal troops marching against American citizens remained vivid and painful,
support for Jefferson's ideals surged dramatically. These weren't just drunk and angry farmers anymore. They were voters, and they were furious about being treated like criminals and potential traitors for resisting taxes they considered unfair and unconstitutional. The rebellion had transformed abstract political philosophy into concrete personal experience. Frontier communities that might have remained politically indifferent suddenly had direct, immediate reasons to distrust federal power and support politicians who promised to limit central government authority. The Whiskey Rebellion thus helped accelerate the formation of America's first genuine political party system, sharpening the divide between those who wanted a strong, centralized federal state and those who preferred decentralized governance that left real power in the hands of local communities and state governments. This wasn't simply a policy disagreement about taxation or economic development. It was a fundamental conflict over the nature of American democracy itself. The Federalists believed that effective government required hierarchical authority and deference to educated leadership. The Republicans believed that democracy meant genuine popular control over government policy, even when that control produced results that educated elites found uncomfortable or inefficient. So while no actual war had broken out during the Whiskey Rebellion, a new kind of political battle had begun. One that would be fought not with muskets and artillery, but with ballots, newspapers, campaign speeches, and competing visions of American identity. The rebellion had failed to overthrow federal tax policy, but it had succeeded in creating a permanent political opposition that would challenge Federalist dominance for decades to come. The Whiskey Rebels had lost their immediate fight against federal taxation, but they had won a much larger victory in the battle for American political culture. They had proven that resistance to federal authority could be politically profitable, even when it was militarily hopeless.
The Whiskey Rebellion may seem like a curious historical footnote today, a quaint episode from America's early years when farmers got worked up about taxes and George Washington had to march an army across Pennsylvania to restore order. But the rebellion's legacy remains surprisingly alive in American political culture, swirling through our national consciousness like vapor rising from an ancient still, influencing everything from presidential power to rural resistance movements. Most immediately, the rebellion established a crucial constitutional precedent that every subsequent president has inherited. The federal government possesses both the legal authority and practical capability to enforce domestic laws with military force when necessary. This was the first time federal troops had been used to suppress domestic resistance, and the fact that it happened under George Washington's personal leadership gave the precedent enormous historical weight and constitutional legitimacy. Every president since Washington, from Abraham Lincoln deploying federal troops during the Civil War to Dwight Eisenhower sending the National Guard to enforce school desegregation, to more recent presidents dealing with domestic unrest, can trace a direct line back to that moment in 1794 when a president on horseback demonstrated that federal authority was more than just words on parchment. But the rebellion's political legacy proved even more significant than its constitutional precedent. The crisis injected lasting skepticism about centralized government deep into the DNA of American political culture, creating a tradition of rural resistance to federal authority that has never entirely disappeared from our national political conversation. Frontier distrust of distant elites became a core component of American political identity that transcends specific policy disagreements or partisan affiliations. It didn't matter that the rebellion itself had failed militarily. What mattered was that it had demonstrated to millions of Americans that federal power could and would be used against ordinary citizens when it suited the interests of wealthy urban political leaders. That spirit of rural defiance echoes through American history in countless ways. You can hear it in anti-tax protests, states' rights arguments, militia movements, and the deep American love of local control over federal mandates. You can see it in political campaigns that pit real Americans against Washington bureaucrats, in constitutional debates about federal versus state authority, and in cultural divisions between urban sophistication and rural authenticity. The rebellion planted seeds of political resistance that never quite died out. They just went underground,
fermenting in the cultural soil of American democracy until they could sprout again during subsequent crises and political realignments. Perhaps most remarkably, whiskey itself emerged from the rebellion with its reputation not only intact but actually enhanced. Far from being demonized as the cause of political violence and social disorder, whiskey became a symbol of American independence, frontier resilience, and resistance to authority. The very substance that had sparked an armed rebellion against federal power became a celebrated part of American cultural identity. Today, the American whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye production, wears its rebellious heritage like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebellion leaders, bottles designed to evoke frontier independence, and marketing slogans that practically dare federal tax collectors to come knocking again. The rebellion transformed whiskey from a simple agricultural product into a symbol of American individualism and resistance to government overreach. The event also taught the young United States something fundamental about democratic governance. How a society responds to domestic dissent reveals everything about its true character and values. Washington's decision to combine overwhelming force with ultimate mercy, to demonstrate federal power while refusing to become tyrannical in victory, established a template for democratic crisis management that has influenced American political behavior for over 2 centuries. The balance between authority and restraint, between law enforcement and political forgiveness, became a cornerstone of American democratic tradition. Not always followed, of course, but always referenced as an ideal worth striving toward. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became legend in the Appalachian Hills and throughout rural America. Stories were passed down through generations of brave distillers standing up to federal agents, of honest farmers defending their rights against distant bureaucrats, of American citizens refusing to be intimidated by government power. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others romanticized beyond recognition, but all carried the same essential message. Government doesn't always represent the people's interests, and sometimes ordinary citizens have to take extraordinary action to defend their rights and freedoms. These cultural memories created a reservoir of skepticism about federal authority that politicians could tap into whenever they needed to mobilize popular opposition to government policies or programs. The whiskey rebels became folk heroes, proof that Americans had always been willing to resist government overreach and fight for their individual liberty. So, the next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember that you're not just consuming an alcoholic beverage, you're participating in a cultural tradition that connects directly to one of the most important constitutional crises in American history. You're toasting a rebellion that helped define the relationship between federal authority and individual liberty, between government power and popular resistance. In that glass is a story of power and protest, of violence avoided and mercy extended, of a young republic learning to balance order with freedom.
Now, my friends, let's journey even further back in time to explore a topic that reveals perhaps more about human civilization than any battle or empire: how ancient societies treated half their population. Tonight, we're diving deep into the legal codes that governed women's lives in the ancient world, beginning with one of humanity's first attempts to write down laws for posterity. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon created something revolutionary: a massive basalt stela covered with cuneiform text that would become one of history's most famous legal documents. Standing nearly 8 feet tall and weighing over 4 tons, this imposing monument was designed to awe subjects and demonstrate divine justice flowing through royal authority. But buried within its 282 carefully carved articles lies something just as ancient and fundamental as law itself: the systematic regulation of women's lives. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman wasn't simply a person with individual rights and responsibilities. She was, first and foremost, a role: daughter, wife, widow, mother. And each of those roles came with precise legal definitions, specific social expectations, and, when things went wrong, carefully prescribed punishments that reflected her relationship to male authority rather than her individual actions. Take marriage, for example, which in Babylonian society was far more legal contract than romantic partnership.
women could be married off by their fathers in arrangements that amounted to transfers of authority from one household to another. The bride moved from her father's control to her husband's control, bringing with her a dowry that served both as insurance policy and property settlement. Once married, a woman was expected to remain absolutely faithful to her husband, and the legal consequences of adultery were both swift and terrifying. If a woman was accused of adultery, both she and her alleged lover could be bound together and thrown into the river, not as metaphor or symbolic punishment, but as literal trial by ordeal where survival indicated divine judgment of innocence. But here's where Hammurabi's code revealed its complex relationship with patriarchal authority. If the husband decided to spare his wife's life, the court often agreed to commute the death sentence. This provision demonstrates how female honor was considered family property rather than individual characteristic. Romantic in a grim sort of way, perhaps, but ultimately revealing about who held real power in these relationships. Meanwhile, if a man cheated on his wife, Hammurabi's code didn't seem particularly concerned. Male infidelity wasn't exactly front-page news in ancient Mesopotamia. The legal imbalance was stark and deliberate. Female honor was family honor, something that could be damaged or preserved by male decision-making, while male honor remained far more flexible and personally controlled. But not all provisions in Hammurabi's code were oppressive toward women. Zum offered surprising protections, especially for widows, who occupied a unique position in Babylonian society. A widow had the legal right to remain in her late husband's house and manage his property until her sons came of age. If there were no sons, she could even inherit directly, a remarkable provision for its time. In this way, Hammurabi's code recognized women's capacity for financial and legal responsibility, but always within the strict boundaries of family structure. Women could own property, manage households, and conduct business, but these rights were conditional upon their relationships to men and their roles within patriarchal family systems. The code also included laws about divorce, though these were heavily weighted in favor of male prerogatives. A woman could theoretically leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but proving such claims was no small task in a legal system that favored male testimony and male authority. If her accusations couldn't be verified to the court's satisfaction, she could be branded a liar and punished severely for making false claims. Justice, it seems, wasn't blind in ancient Babylon. It just squinted harder when the accused wore a veil and challenged male authority. The legal system was designed to maintain social order, and social order depended on clear hierarchies of power that placed women in subordinate positions to the men who supposedly protected and provided for them. What Hammurabi's code teaches us about women in ancient Babylon is that they weren't invisible or ignored by the legal system. Far from it. They were named, categorized, judged, and occasionally protected by an elaborate legal framework. But they were always defined and constrained through the lens of male control and family structure. The law gave women a place in society, but rarely gave them the power to shape that place according to their own desires or interests. They could inherit property, but usually only in the absence of male heirs. They could seek divorce, but only under circumstances that male judges deemed sufficiently extreme. They could manage households and conduct business, but always under the ultimate authority of fathers, husbands, or sons. This legal framework established patterns that would echo through ancient civilizations for thousands of years, patterns that recognized women as legal persons while simultaneously restricting their legal personhood within narrow boundaries defined by male authority and patriarchal family systems. In many ways, Hammurabi's code represents both the beginning of written law and the codification of gender inequality that would shape legal systems across the ancient world.
Travel a few hundred miles west from Babylon and fast forward a few centuries, and you arrive in ancient Egypt, a civilization where the scales of justice were personified by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Unlike many of their neighbors in the ancient world,
The Egyptians developed surprisingly progressive attitudes toward women's legal rights, at least on papyrus, creating a system that would seem remarkably modern to contemporary observers. Egyptian women, whether born into wealthy noble families or humble farming households, possessed legal rights that would have astonished their contemporaries in Mesopotamia or later Greece. They could own property independently, inherit land from their parents, sue and be sued in courts, initiate divorce proceedings, and enter into business contracts, rights that weren't merely theoretical provisions etched onto tomb walls, but were actively practiced and enforced, particularly in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. A woman could run her own business, lend money at interest, purchase slaves and livestock for her household, and manage complex financial transactions without requiring male permission or oversight. Egyptian law recognized women as complete legal individuals, rather than extensions of their husbands or eternal minors requiring male guardianship. This autonomy was genuinely ahead of its time and represented a level of legal equality that wouldn't be matched in many other civilizations for thousands of years. Women weren't excluded from temples, courts, or other important public institutions. Priestesses played crucial legal and ritual roles in Egyptian society, and some even served as judges or scribes, positions of considerable authority and respect. Legal documents from the New Kingdom period show women successfully filing complaints against male relatives and winning their cases in court, demonstrating that female legal agency wasn't just theoretical, but practically enforceable. But, and there's always a significant but when discussing women's rights in ancient societies, this relative legal freedom operated within important social constraints that limited its practical impact. Most women still lived under the economic and social authority of fathers or husbands, and while they could own land, they were often expected to pass inheritances down through male heirs to preserve family lineages and property consolidation. The law might say yes to female independence, but society often whispered not quite when it came to actually exercising that independence in ways that challenged traditional family structures or male authority. Marriage in Egypt, while not considered a religious institution requiring temple ceremonies, was still legally binding and carried significant social expectations. However, Egyptian marriage law was remarkably equitable compared to other ancient systems. Husbands and wives could divorce for various reasons: infertility, infidelity, emotional incompatibility, or simple mutual disagreement. And divorce didn't carry the social stigma that it bore in many other ancient cultures. Children from divorced marriages were usually cared for by their mothers, who retained rights to their dowries and often received additional property settlements. Women could remarry without losing their property or social standing, and widows frequently managed their deceased husbands' estates until their children came of age, sometimes continuing to control family businesses and property for decades. The Egyptian legal system theoretically provided equal treatment under law, regardless of gender, but practical application revealed the same class-based inequalities that characterized most ancient societies. A noble woman could get away with behaviors and actions that would send a peasant woman to face the crocodiles, literally, since crocodile pools were sometimes used for executions in ancient Egypt. Wealth, family connections, and social status mattered far more than gender when it came to actual legal outcomes. A rich woman with powerful relatives could manipulate the legal system to her advantage, while a poor woman with no family support might find herself completely defenseless against accusations or legal attacks. So was ancient Egypt a feminist paradise, a beacon of gender equality shining across the ancient world? Certainly not. But compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia, Greece, or later Roman systems, Egypt offered women something genuinely rare and valuable: the legal ability to participate in public life as autonomous people rather than as property belonging to male relatives. In a world dominated by gods and pharaohs, where divine authority flowed through royal bloodlines and cosmic order depended on maintaining proper hierarchies, The fact that women could own property, conduct business, and seek justice in courts represented a remarkable deviation from typical ancient patterns of male dominance. Egyptian women could serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, act as guardians for minor children, draft wills disposing of their property, and even serve as executors for deceased relatives' estates. These weren't just privileges granted to exceptional women of royal blood, they were legal rights available to ordinary women throughout Egyptian society. The goddess Maat, who personified justice and cosmic balance, was depicted as female, and this imagery reflected deeper cultural attitudes that saw women as capable of wisdom, judgment, and moral authority. While Egyptian society was certainly not egalitarian by modern standards, it created legal frameworks that recognized female agency and competence in ways that wouldn't become common in Western civilization until the modern era. The Egyptian model demonstrates that ancient societies were capable of developing more equitable legal systems when cultural values and practical necessities aligned to support women's participation in economic and legal life. It also shows us that progress toward gender equality isn't inevitable or linear. Legal rights that existed in ancient Egypt disappeared in later civilizations and had to be fought for and won all over again by subsequent generations of women.
In ancient India, the legal world of women was governed by Dharma, the moral and social order that formed the beating heart of Hindu philosophy and daily life. Codified in texts like the Manusmriti, or Laws of Manu, this intricate framework created a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system where women were simultaneously honored, protected, respected, and constrained, so long as they remained carefully within their prescribed places in the cosmic order. The Manusmriti, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, had an enormous amount to say about women, much of it contradictory in ways that reveal the complex tensions within ancient Hindu thought about female nature and social roles. On one page, it declared with reverent certainty that where women are honored, the gods rejoice. On another page, it warned with equal authority that a woman must never be independent. This philosophical tension between reverence and restriction, between divine praise and domestic captivity, characterized the entire Hindu approach to women's legal status. Women were sacred, but sacred in the way that temple statues are sacred, revered and protected, but not expected to move freely or make independent decisions about their own lives. Hindu law legally bound women to male guardians throughout their entire lives in what scholars call the triad of male control. A woman must obey her father during childhood, her husband during marriage, and her sons during widowhood. This wasn't merely cultural expectation or social custom, it was encoded directly into religious law as part of the cosmic order that maintained harmony between earthly and divine realms. Autonomy wasn't the ideal in Hindu legal philosophy, obedience was. Individual freedom was less important than maintaining the delicate balance of social roles and responsibilities that kept the universe functioning properly. Women who challenged these arrangements weren't just breaking human law, they were disrupting cosmic harmony and threatening the spiritual well-being of their entire community. Marriage laws were especially rigid and comprehensive, reflecting the central importance of family structure in Hindu society. A woman's primary duty was to marry, bear sons, and serve her husband faithfully. These weren't optional life choices. They were religious obligations that determined her spiritual status and her family's social standing. Widow remarriage was generally frowned upon or outright banned depending on caste membership and historical period. The infamous practice of sati, where widows were expected or pressured to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre, wasn't universally enforced, but it found moral validation in some legal and religious texts.
The Manusmriti didn't explicitly command sati, but it also didn't condemn it, creating a moral gray area that allowed the practice to flourish in certain regions and time periods. However, Hindu law wasn't uniformly oppressive toward women. There were important exceptions and variations that provided opportunities for female agency and authority. Women of the upper castes sometimes received education in Sanskrit, philosophy, and religious texts. They could inherit property in the absence of male heirs, particularly in southern regions where matrilineal traditions had deeper roots. Some regions and historical periods saw women serving as advisors to rulers, as accomplished poets and scholars, and even as political leaders in their own right. The ancient Indian epics celebrate heroines like Draupadi and Sita, who, while operating within patriarchal constraints, demonstrated intelligence, courage, and moral authority that influenced major political and military decisions. Divorce was rare and generally discouraged, but certain grounds, such as impotence, extreme cruelty, or complete abandonment, were sometimes recognized as legitimate reasons for ending marriages. Still, men had far more legal freedom to dissolve marriages, and women who sought divorce faced significant social stigma and practical difficulties in supporting themselves afterward. Punishment under Hindu law was explicitly gendered, reflecting different expectations for male and female behavior. A woman caught in adultery could be disfigured, outcasted from her community, or even executed, depending on local customs and the severity of the perceived offense. A man caught in similar circumstances might face fines or social disapproval, but punishments were typically far less severe, especially if he belonged to a high caste or had political connections. The concept of ritual purity played a massive role in how women were legally perceived and socially treated. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from religious activities, temple worship, and even physical contact with family members. These laws reinforced ideas about female otherness, not necessarily as sinful or evil, but as symbolically set apart from normal social and religious life. Yet, the Hindu legal tradition also preserved stories of remarkable women who transcended typical restrictions through exceptional wisdom, devotion, or circumstances. The Hebrew Bible equivalent would be figures like Deborah the judge, Ruth, the Moabite widow who successfully navigated inheritance laws, and Queen Esther, who bent royal law to save her people. These women were rare exceptions, but their presence in sacred texts revealed that the law wasn't always airtight, and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes create space where rigid legal codes had seemingly closed all doors. In short, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in layers of veneration and restriction, creating a system where they were sacred but constrained, revered but rarely empowered to make fundamental decisions about their own lives. They were honored like temple statues rather than respected like free citizens. Beautiful, valuable, and carefully protected, but not expected to move independently or shape their own destinies.
When we think of ancient Greece, our minds immediately conjure images of democracy, philosophy, and dramatic theater, the birthplace of Western civilization, where rational thought and individual liberty first flourished. But for approximately half the population of Greek city-states, the legal system was far less about democratic ideals and far more about systematic invisibility, particularly in classical Athens, where women were legally treated not as autonomous individuals, but as permanent minors requiring lifelong male guardianship. Athenian law created a legal framework that was breathtaking in its comprehensive exclusion of women from public life. Women couldn't vote in democratic assemblies, couldn't own property independently, couldn't represent themselves in court proceedings, couldn't even enter into legal contracts, and couldn't even leave their houses without male escorts.
If Hammurabi's code had defined women as legally subordinate, Athens perfected the art of locking them out of civic life entirely. Marriage in Athenian society was fundamentally a property transaction rather than a romantic partnership. A woman's kurios, usually her father, brother, or closest male relative, arranged her marriage as part of broader family alliances and economic agreements. The bride herself moved into her husband's household along with her dowry, becoming part of an exchange of property and political connections between male-controlled families. Legally speaking, she was transferred like valuable livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men who made all important decisions about her life, her children, and her future. She had no more say in her marriage arrangements than a prize cow would have in choosing which farm to live on. Yet paradoxically, her sexual fidelity was considered enormously important to Athenian legal and social order. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could immediately divorce her and keep her dowry as compensation for the dishonor she had brought upon his household. Any man caught with a married woman could be executed without trial, a punishment that reflected not concern for the woman's autonomy, but anxiety about property rights and family honor. The irony was staggering. While married women faced death for sexual infidelity, her husbands could freely sleep with courtesans, prostitutes, or slaves without any legal consequences whatsoever. Double standards weren't just common in Athenian society, they were built into the legal architecture that governed daily life. Women couldn't initiate divorce proceedings themselves, though they could return to their fathers' houses if abandoned or severely mistreated by their husbands. However, any legal action taken on their behalf had to be conducted by male relatives acting as representatives. Even in cases of rape or physical assault, women couldn't bring charges directly. Their kurios had to speak for them in legal proceedings. There were notable exceptions to these restrictions. In Sparta, women enjoyed considerably more freedom than their Athenian counterparts. Spartan women could own land, receive physical education, walk freely through their cities, and exercise significant influence over family decisions. But Spartan women were definitely the anomaly rather than the rule in Greek legal culture. In most Greek city-states, a respectable woman's name was supposed to be spoken as little as possible in public. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible, present in society but not participating in it, essential for family life but excluded from civic life, valuable but voiceless. The Athenian legal philosopher Aristotle articulated the prevailing view when he argued that women were naturally inferior to men in their capacity for rational thought and moral judgment. This wasn't considered prejudice. It was understood as scientific observation that justified legal restrictions and social limitations. Women were seen as emotionally unstable, intellectually limited, and morally weak, requiring male guidance and protection throughout their lives. And yet, despite these comprehensive legal limitations, Greek women found ways to endure, adapt, and occasionally exercise influence within the constraints of their society. They raised generations of Greek children, managed complex households, participated in religious festivals and rituals, and in some rare cases, wielded behind-the-scenes political influence through their relationships with powerful men. Women played crucial roles in Greek religious life, serving as priestesses, participating in mystery cults, and maintaining household shrines. Some religious festivals were exclusively female affairs, where women could gather, socialize, and exercise temporary autonomy from male supervision. These religious spaces provided important opportunities for female community and limited self-expression. But officially, legally, and politically, Greek women remained shadows in a civilization that prized logic, liberty, and democratic participation, but only for men. They existed at the margins of a legal system that celebrated individual freedom while systematically denying that freedom to half the population. The Greek example demonstrates how societies can develop sophisticated legal and philosophical systems while maintaining profound inequalities based on gender, class, or other social categories. Democratic ideals and legal innovations can coexist with systematic oppression when the benefits of citizenship are narrowly defined and jealously guarded by those who hold power. Greek civilization gave the world democracy, philosophy, and theater, but it also demonstrated how exclusion and inequality can be built into the very foundations of legal and political systems that claim to value freedom and justice.
In the world of ancient Rome, law was a powerful and sophisticated instrument of social organization, and like everything else Roman, it was deeply structured, meticulously hierarchical, and relentlessly pragmatic. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any measure, but compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a significantly more visible and legally complex position within the broader architecture of imperial society. At birth, every Roman woman fell under the patria potestas, or absolute authority of her father, who held legal power over her life, death, property, and marriage arrangements. This wasn't merely social custom. It was fundamental legal doctrine that granted fathers nearly unlimited control over their children's lives, including the right to sell them into slavery or order their execution for serious offenses. Upon marriage, that patriarchal authority could follow one of two distinct legal paths. In cum manu marriage, authority transferred completely to the husband, making the wife legally equivalent to his daughter and placing her entirely under his household control. In sine manu marriage, authority remained with her natal family, allowing married women to retain legal ties to their original households and manage property independently in certain circumstances. The sine manu arrangement became increasingly common over time and created opportunities for women, especially wealthy widows or daughters of prominent families, to own estates, manage businesses, draft contracts, and accumulate substantial personal wealth. This legal flexibility reflected Roman pragmatism. If women could contribute to family prosperity and social stability through economic activity, the law would accommodate such contributions while maintaining overall male dominance and patriarchal authority. While women couldn't vote in popular assemblies or hold elected offices, they could appear in court proceedings, often with male sponsors, serve as legal guardians for minor children, and accumulate property through inheritance, business ventures, or investment activities. Roman law recognized female economic agency in ways that would have scandalized Greek philosophers or Hebrew religious authorities. Still, Roman law maintained firm boundaries around acceptable female behavior and social roles. The ideal Roman woman was pudica, modest, loyal, obedient, and devoted to family welfare above personal ambitions. Adultery, once treated as a private family matter, became a public crime under Augustus's moral legislation, reflecting imperial concern about marriage, reproduction, and social order. A woman found guilty of adultery could lose her dowry, face exile from Rome, or suffer even more severe punishments depending on her social status and the political circumstances surrounding her case. Meanwhile, male infidelity remained legally non-problematic unless it involved relationships with married women from respectable families. Another example of how Roman law protected male honor and property rights while restricting female sexual autonomy. However, certain unique roles offered dramatic exceptions to typical female legal limitations. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses who maintained the sacred flame of Vesta, were the only women in Roman society completely free from male guardianship. They swore 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense social prestige, legal independence, and extraordinary powers, including the ability to pardon condemned prisoners. But a Vestal who broke her vow of chastity faced burial alive, a punishment that reflected both the sacred importance of their religious role and the terrible consequences of challenging divine and social order. Divine authority came with divine-level consequences for failure or disobedience.
Roman matrons, respectable married women from upper-class families, held significant informal social and political power despite their formal legal limitations. They influenced political decisions through family connections, arranged strategic marriages between prominent families, organized public mourning rituals that could affect political outcomes, and sometimes funded public works projects or religious festivals. The Roman legal system acknowledged their social importance through property protections, inheritance rights, and legal mechanisms like tutela, a form of male guardianship that became increasingly symbolic rather than practical as the empire matured. By the imperial period, wealthy women often functioned as independent economic actors while maintaining the legal fiction of male supervision. The Roman legal system created the legal framework for divorce, which could be initiated by either husbands or wives under certain circumstances. While men had broader grounds for divorce and greater legal advantages in property settlements, women weren't completely powerless in marriage dissolution. They could retain their dowries, maintain relationships with their children, and often remarry without significant social stigma. The Roman approach to women's legal status reflected broader imperial pragmatism. If legal arrangements contributed to social stability, economic prosperity, and family continuity, they would be accommodated within the overall framework of male dominance and patriarchal authority. Roman law was flexible enough to permit considerable female agency while maintaining the hierarchical social order that imperial governance required. So, while Roman women lived within a legal cage of male authority and social expectations, the bars were spaced far enough apart to allow significant movement and influence, especially for those born into wealth, prominence, or exceptional circumstances. They were constrained by law and custom, but never entirely silenced or rendered invisible in the way that characterized some other ancient legal systems. This pragmatic approach to female legal status would influence European legal traditions for centuries, creating precedents for property rights, marriage law, and family authority that shaped medieval and early modern legal development throughout the former Roman territories.
In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't merely a civic structure designed to maintain social order. It was divine instruction flowing directly from God through Moses, and later interpreted by rabbis and religious scholars. These religious legal texts created a comprehensive framework that governed every aspect of daily life, including the specific roles, rights, and restrictions placed on women within the covenant community. Like many ancient legal systems, Hebrew law both elevated and constrained women, creating a complex relationship between spiritual dignity and social subordination that reflected broader ancient Near Eastern patterns while adding distinctive theological dimensions to questions of gender, family, and community life. At the heart of Hebrew law stood the patriarchal family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of household life while remaining under clear male authority throughout their entire lives. Fathers arranged marriages and managed family property. Husbands served as heads of household with legal and religious responsibilities. Sons inherited land and family names. Daughters were expected to marry into other families, bringing dowries with them, but typically receiving no inheritance rights unless there were no male heirs available. However, women weren't voiceless within this patriarchal structure. The ketubah, a marriage contract that developed in later Jewish legal tradition, provided women with important legal security by specifying financial support obligations and outlining mutual responsibilities within marriage. If a husband failed to provide adequate food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek divorce through rabbinical courts or family intervention. But she couldn't initiate divorce proceedings directly. Male relatives or rabbinical authorities had to advocate on her behalf, reflecting the broader pattern of male mediation that characterized Hebrew legal culture. Women could seek justice, but they needed male allies to access legal remedies.
Adultery laws revealed stark gender inequalities that reflected ancient concerns about paternity, inheritance, and family honor. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death according to Deuteronomic law, a punishment that applied equally to her male partner if he was also married. But if the woman was unmarried or enslaved, the legal consequences became much more complicated, usually resulting in financial compensation or forced marriage, depending on the social status of everyone involved. In cases of rape, Hebrew law demanded financial compensation and marriage between the perpetrator and victim, an arrangement that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. From the ancient perspective, this provision protected women from social ostracism and economic destitution following sexual assault. But it also prioritized male property rights and family honor over female autonomy and psychological welfare. Ritual purity laws played an enormous role in how women were legally and socially perceived within Hebrew society. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily excluded from religious worship, temple activities, and physical contact with family members. These restrictions reinforced ideas about female otherness, not necessarily as sinful or evil, but as symbolically set apart from normal religious and social life. These purity laws affected not only individual women, but entire households and communities, since ritual impurity could be transmitted through contact and required specific purification procedures before normal religious life could resume. Women's biological functions were thus integrated into broader religious and legal frameworks that governed community worship and social interaction. And yet, the Hebrew Bible preserves remarkable stories of women who transcended typical legal and social restrictions through exceptional wisdom, faith, or circumstances. Deborah served as both prophet and judge, leading Israel in military and legal matters during a crucial period of national history. Ruth, a Moabite widow, successfully navigated complex inheritance laws and family obligations to secure economic survival and ethnic inclusion. Queen Esther manipulated royal law and court politics to save the Jewish people from genocidal persecution. These women were clearly exceptional rather than typical, but their presence in sacred texts revealed that Hebrew law and society weren't completely closed to female leadership, wisdom, or public influence. Legal codes might establish general patterns of male authority, but faith, intelligence, and extraordinary circumstances could sometimes create space for female agency where rigid rules had seemingly eliminated all possibilities. Prophetic literature also includes powerful critiques of social injustice that specifically mention the oppression of widows, orphans, and other vulnerable populations, including women who lacked male protection or economic support. These texts suggested that divine justice demanded care for the powerless, and that legal systems failing to protect vulnerable women violated fundamental religious obligations. Hebrew law thus created a fascinating tension between divine dignity and earthly hierarchy. Women were created in God's image and called to participate in covenant community life, but their participation was channeled through patriarchal family structures and male religious authority. They possessed spiritual worth and legal rights, but those rights were defined and mediated by male relatives and religious leaders. This combination of theological dignity and practical subordination would profoundly influence later Christian and Islamic legal traditions, creating lasting patterns of simultaneous reverence and restriction that characterized religious approaches to women's legal status throughout much of subsequent history.
The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over an extraordinarily vast and diverse population stretching from India to Greece, from Egypt to Central Asia. This sprawling imperial domain included Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Medes, Jews, and dozens of other ethnic and cultural groups, each with their own legal traditions, religious practices, and social customs regarding women's roles and rights.
In governing this massive multicultural empire, Persian rulers developed an approach to law that operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatic flexibility that was genuinely uncommon among ancient imperial systems. Rather than imposing uniform Persian legal codes throughout their territories, they generally allowed local communities to maintain their traditional legal practices while providing overarching imperial oversight for major political and economic matters. This legal flexibility extended in particularly interesting ways to questions about women's status and rights, creating opportunities for female agency and authority that varied significantly depending on local customs, social class, and proximity to imperial power structures. While Persian law wasn't systematically codified in a single monumental document like Hammurabi's Code, administrative records, court documents, and royal inscriptions reveal that women, especially elite women connected to the imperial court, enjoyed considerable legal presence and practical authority within the Persian system. Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous and powerful in the entire ancient world. In the imperial court, women like Atassa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense political and economic influence that went far beyond ceremonial or decorative roles. She controlled vast agricultural estates, issued administrative commands to regional governors, managed large-scale construction projects, and appeared in official imperial inscriptions not as ornamental figures, but as genuine landowners and political actors. Administrative records from the Persepolis fortification archives show women routinely receiving food rations, managing work crews, overseeing production activities on royal estates, and exercising supervisory authority over both male and female workers. These weren't isolated, exceptional cases. They represent systematic patterns of female economic and administrative participation that characterized Persian imperial governance. High-ranking women, especially those with family connections to the royal dynasty, possessed legal authority over land, labor, and property that would have been unthinkable in contemporary Greek city-states or traditional Hebrew communities. The Persian system seemed to recognize that effective imperial administration required utilizing available talent and authority regardless of gender, at least among the elite classes. Marriage and family law in Persian society combined local cultural traditions with overarching imperial legal frameworks. Persian women could own property independently, enter into contracts, inherit land from their families, and manage business affairs without requiring male guardianship or permission. These rights were often more secure than comparable rights in Greece or Rome, reflecting Persian legal pragmatism and cultural confidence. Dowries were legally protected through imperial law, and women could reclaim their dowries if marriages ended through divorce or widowhood. Divorce was legally possible for both men and women, though the practical process often favored husbands unless wives could demonstrate serious abuse, infertility, or complete abandonment of marriage obligations. However, Persian law still reflected gendered expectations and punishments that favored male authority and social control. Adultery remained a capital offense, especially for women, though the methods and severity of punishment varied significantly depending on social class and local customs. A noblewoman accused of adultery might face exile or house arrest, while a servant or slave could be executed immediately. The Persian legal system consistently reflected hierarchical social organization where class and status mattered more than gender in determining legal outcomes and social opportunities. A wealthy, well-connected woman from a prominent family could exercise more legal authority and social influence than poor men from subordinate ethnic groups or lower social classes. Zoroastrianism, the Persian Empire's dominant religious tradition, also influenced Persian attitudes toward women and legal relationships between the sexes. While Zoroastrian theology emphasized spiritual equality between men and women in cosmic dualism between good and evil, practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions around menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact that echoed similar patterns in Hebrew and Hindu legal systems. These purity laws created temporary limitations on women's participation in religious ceremonies and social activities, but they didn't establish permanent legal subordination or systematic exclusion from public life in the way that characterized some other ancient religious legal systems. The Persian approach to women's legal status reflected the broader imperial strategy of pragmatic accommodation within hierarchical control. Local communities could maintain their traditional gender roles and family structures as long as they didn't interfere with imperial taxation, military service, or political loyalty. Elite Persian women could exercise considerable authority and influence as long as they supported imperial interests and maintained appropriate social relationships. In all, Persian law offered women a curious and complex mixture of freedom through rank, respect through religious tradition, and limitations through custom and class. The higher a woman's social status and the closer her family connections to imperial power, the louder her legal voice and the broader her opportunities for independent action and authority. This Persian model demonstrates how ancient legal systems could accommodate significant female agency when political pragmatism and cultural confidence aligned to support women's participation in economic and administrative life, even within fundamentally patriarchal social structures.
In ancient China, law represented far more than a simple system of rules and punishments. It was a sophisticated expression of cosmic harmony, social hierarchy, and Confucian moral philosophy that sought to maintain proper relationships between heaven and earth, ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife. For women, this meant living within a legal and cultural framework that viewed them primarily through the lens of family roles and social duty, rather than individual rights or personal autonomy. The earliest codified Chinese legal systems emerged during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, that legal structures began to crystallize alongside Confucian ideological frameworks that would influence Chinese law and society for over 2,000 years. Confucian teachings emphasized what became known as the three obediences. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons during widowhood. This wasn't merely moral advice or social suggestion. It represented fundamental legal expectations that influenced actual court proceedings, inheritance laws, marriage regulations, and criminal justice throughout imperial Chinese history. The three obediences established a legal framework where women remained under male authority throughout their entire lives, moving from one form of patriarchal control to another without ever achieving independent legal status. Women were legally subordinate to men in virtually all contexts. They could not hold public office, rarely appeared in court as independent legal actors, and were systematically excluded from inheritance rights, especially in patrilineal families where property and family names passed through male descendants. A daughter might be beloved within her birth family, but the law viewed her as essentially temporary. She would eventually marry out, taking her dowry with her, but leaving family property and ancestral obligations to male heirs. Marriage functioned as both family alliance and legal contract, carefully negotiated between families to strengthen social networks, economic relationships, and political connections. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy, illness, failure to produce male heirs, or even excessive talking, though he couldn't do so if she had no family to return to, had properly mourned his parents during their deaths, or had borne him sons who could continue the family lineage. Women, by contrast, possessed no legal power to initiate divorce proceedings unless they could demonstrate extreme physical abuse or complete abandonment. And even then, their cases typically depended on male relatives stepping forward to advocate on their behalf through family networks or local magistrates.
Adultery laws reflected strong gender bias that tied female sexual behavior directly to family honor and social stability. A woman caught in adultery could be executed, while a man's sexual relationships with servants, concubines, or unmarried women were often legally overlooked entirely as long as they didn't threaten legitimate marriage relationships or family inheritance patterns. The legal system viewed women's reproductive capacity as family and social property rather than individual biological function. A woman's primary value lay in her ability to produce male heirs who could continue ancestral worship, maintain family property, and fulfill filial obligations to deceased parents and grandparents. However, Chinese legal history wasn't uniform in its treatment of women, and there were notable exceptions that demonstrated the possibility for female authority and influence within Confucian frameworks. Some dynasties saw the rise of powerful imperial women like Empress Lu Ji and Empress Wu Zetian, who wielded immense political power and sometimes bent legal codes to accommodate their ambitions and administrative needs. These women succeeded not by rejecting Confucian values, but by manipulating them skillfully, presenting their authority as necessary for family stability, dynastic continuity, or imperial welfare, rather than as challenges to fundamental social order. They operated within patriarchal systems while simultaneously transcending typical limitations through exceptional intelligence, political skill, and favorable circumstances. In rural villages and merchant families, widows who managed households or inherited family businesses could exercise considerable informal authority even when the formal legal system didn't explicitly recognize their independence. Local communities sometimes developed practical accommodations that allowed capable women to maintain family enterprises, manage property, or serve as household heads when male relatives were absent or incompetent. Chinese law also recognized certain situations where women could inherit property or exercise legal authority, typically when no male heirs were available and family continuity required female management of ancestral obligations and economic resources. These exceptions were carefully limited and usually temporary, designed to preserve family structures rather than establish permanent female authority. The relationship between law and cosmic order meant that legal systems weren't just about individual rights or social convenience. They were about maintaining the harmonious relationships between different levels of existence that kept the universe functioning properly. Everyone, but especially women, needed to understand and accept their proper place within these larger patterns of cosmic and social organization. In short, ancient Chinese law viewed women less as autonomous individuals and more as essential stabilizers of familial and social order, vital to society's proper functioning, but always secondary to the male relatives who supposedly maintained cosmic harmony through their political, economic, and ritual authority. This Confucian approach to women's legal status would influence East Asian legal traditions for centuries, creating lasting patterns of family-centered social organization that balanced female dignity with systematic male authority and emphasized collective harmony over individual autonomy.
As we step back from our journey through the ancient world and survey the vast landscape of legal systems we've explored tonight, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, from the temples of Egypt to the courts of Persia, one profound truth emerges with remarkable clarity. Women were always present in ancient law, but they were rarely the authors of their own legal stories. Nearly every ancient legal system we've examined assigned women specific roles within fundamentally male-dominated structures. Whether we're discussing Hammurabi's detailed provisions for marriage and property, the Manusmriti's elaborate regulations for female behavior, or the Confucian three obediences that governed Chinese family life for millennia,
The fundamental legal assumption that transcended cultural boundaries was that a woman's identity was relational rather than individual. She was defined as daughter, wife, mother, or widow, roles that carried specific legal rights and responsibilities, but always in relationship to the men around her, rather than as autonomous legal persons with independent authority over their own lives. Law defined women, categorized them, and often protected them, but it rarely empowered them to define themselves or shape the legal frameworks that governed their daily existence. Their rights and responsibilities flowed through male relatives, religious authorities, or government officials who served as intermediaries between women and legal institutions. Yet our exploration has also revealed fascinating variations in how different civilizations approach these fundamental questions about women's legal status and social roles. Some ancient societies, like Egypt and Persia, developed legal frameworks that offered women considerably more autonomy and economic agency, allowing elite women to own property, manage businesses, initiate contracts, and even inherit substantial wealth and political authority. In these societies, noble or wealthy women could carve out significant spaces of legal independence that sometimes rivaled or even exceeded the authority available to lower-class men. Egyptian priestesses serving as judges, Persian royal women controlling vast estates, or Chinese empresses wielding imperial power demonstrated that ancient legal systems could accommodate remarkable female agency when cultural values, practical necessities, and political circumstances aligned appropriately. But these privileges were far from universal. They typically depended on social class, family connections, and exceptional circumstances, rather than reflecting any underlying belief in fundamental gender equality or women's inherent right to legal autonomy and self-determination. Other ancient societies, most notably Greece and Rome, developed extraordinarily sophisticated legal and political systems while simultaneously creating elaborate mechanisms for excluding women from public life and maintaining systematic male control over female behavior, property rights, and social participation. Greek women were rendered legally invisible in city-states that celebrated democracy and rational thought. Roman women gained more practical agency than their Greek counterparts, but still operated within carefully maintained scaffolding of male guardianship and social expectations that limited their legal independence and political participation. Religious legal systems added another layer of complexity to these patterns. Jewish halakha, Hindu dharma, and Zoroastrian purity codes often placed women at the symbolic intersection between sacred and profane realms, where female bodies and behaviors could bring either honor or ritual contamination to families and communities depending on how carefully women followed religious regulations and social expectations. These religious frameworks simultaneously elevated women's spiritual significance while restricting their practical autonomy, creating legal systems where women were honored as morally and spiritually important while being denied the legal tools to make independent decisions about their own religious and social lives. What becomes clear from this comparative analysis is that ancient legal attitudes toward women reflected deeper cultural beliefs about power, order, social stability, and cosmic harmony. Legal systems didn't just regulate individual behavior, they expressed fundamental assumptions about who deserved to wield authority, make decisions, own property, and participate in public life. And yet, within all these systems of legal constraint and social limitation, women found ways to adapt, resist, endure, and occasionally transcend the boundaries that law and custom had established around their lives. They exercised influence through family relationships, religious authority, economic activity, and sometimes sheer determination and intelligence that couldn't be completely suppressed by legal restrictions. Their stories may not always be prominently carved into stone monuments or extensively documented in official court records, but they moved beneath the surface of ancient civilizations, shaping households, influencing political decisions, managing economic resources, raising children who would become leaders, and maintaining cultural and religious traditions that held societies together across generations of change and crisis. Ultimately, these ancient legal codes tell us not only how past societies treated women, but how they understood power itself, who deserved to possess it, how it should be exercised, what purposes it should serve, and what dangers it might create if placed in the wrong hands. The legal frameworks we've explored tonight established patterns of thought and social organization that would influence legal development for thousands of years, creating precedents and assumptions about gender, authority, and social order that later civilizations would inherit, modify, reject, or expand depending on their own cultural values and historical circumstances. Understanding these ancient legal traditions helps us appreciate both how far human societies have progressed toward greater equality and justice, and how deeply rooted some forms of inequality and discrimination remain in legal and social systems that still bear traces of these ancient assumptions about women's proper roles and capabilities. From Babylon to Beijing, from Memphis to Athens, the ancient world created legal systems that recognized women's importance while limiting their independence. Patterns that remind us that the struggle for legal equality and social justice has ancient roots and requires constant vigilance to maintain and expand. And so, my friends, we conclude tonight's journey through the corridors of history. Having explored the trenches and rations of World War II, the whiskey stills and federal armies of early America, and the ancient legal codes that governed half of humanity for thousands of years. Each of these stories reminds us that history isn't just about the famous names and grand events that fill textbooks. It's about the daily experiences of ordinary people trying to survive, adapt, and maintain their humanity under extraordinary circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this exploration through time. Thank you for your curiosity, your engagement, and for being part of our community of learners and storytellers. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. There are countless more stories waiting to be discovered together. And from wherever you are in this vast world, whatever time you inhabit as you listen to these final words, sleep well tonight. Dream of ancient civilizations and modern struggles, of courage found in unexpected places, of justice slowly emerging from injustice, and of the continuing human story that we all help write with our choices and actions. Good night.